The hotel key card was still in her coat pocket when she walked through her front door that night. I found it 3 days later. I wasn't looking for it. That's the thing about discovering a lie that has been running for a long time inside your own house. You don't find it because you went searching. You find it because it got careless, because the person telling it got comfortable, because somewhere along the way they stopped being afraid of you and started being afraid of something else entirely. I found the key card on a Wednesday morning in February, going through the coat closet for my own jacket. It fell out of her coat pocket and landed face up on the floor. The hotel name was printed across the front, a place on the north side of Atlanta I had never been to and had never heard my wife mention. I stood there for a long time looking at it. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I was not a suspicious man. I had never been the kind of husband who checked phones or asked questions that were really accusations dressed up as conversation. 5 years of marriage had not made me paranoid. If anything, 5 years of marriage had done the opposite. It had made me comfortable. It had made me certain in the way that people become certain when nothing has ever happened to challenge the story they've built their life around. That key card challenged it. Not conclusively. Not yet. There were explanations. Work events. A surprise she was planning. Something I was forgetting. I ran through all of them standing in that closet with the card in my hand, and I put it back where I found it, and I went to work and I did not say a word. But I started paying attention. My name is Marcus. I'm 41 years old. I grew up in Decatur, went to Georgia State, spent my 30s building a career in commercial real estate that finally started paying what it was worth around the time I turned 36. By the time any of this happened, I was doing well. Not wealthy, comfortable. The kind of comfortable that lets you stop thinking about money and start thinking about everything else. I met Danielle at a birthday party for a mutual friend in the summer of 2018. She was 30 at the time, working in marketing for a healthcare company downtown, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately understood its social architecture. She knew who mattered, who was performing, who was genuinely there. She had a way of making you feel like she had chosen you specifically out of everyone available, which I understand now was not a quality unique to her relationship with me. It was just how she operated. We dated for a year and a half before I proposed. We married in October 2019, 60 people at a venue in Midtown, her mother crying through the entire ceremony, my father giving a toast that went 8 minutes longer than anyone expected and was somehow still not long enough. It was a good wedding. For a long time, I believed it was the beginning of a good marriage. I didn't realize it at the time, but the story Danielle was performing for me and the story she was actually living had started to separate long before I found that key card. The key card was just the moment the separation became physical evidence. The first year was good. I want to be honest about that. Whatever came later, the first year was real, or felt real, which for a long time I thought was the same thing. We built the life you build in the first year. The apartment in Buckhead that we spent 3 weekends furnishing. The Sunday routine that became sacred without us deciding it would. The arguments that stayed small and resolved before they calcified into anything permanent. The second year was mostly good. The third year is where I would go back to if I could. Not because anything specific happened in the third year that I could point to and say, that was the moment. Nothing that clean. More because when I look back now with the full picture in front of me, the third year is where the texture of things started to change. Subtle enough that I explained it away every time. Significant enough that I remember it now with a clarity that feels almost like grief. Danielle started going to the gym in the evenings. That was the first thing. She had always been health conscious. That wasn't new, but the routine shifted from mornings, which had always been her preference, to evenings 3 or 4 nights a week, sometimes not getting home until 8:30 or 9. The gym she had joined was new, different from the one she'd always used. Better equipment, she said. Better classes. Further away, I noticed but didn't say. I didn't say a lot of things in that third year. I was busy. That's the honest answer. The commercial real estate market in Atlanta had started moving in ways that require my full attention. And I was putting in the hours. And when you're putting in the hours at work, you develop a habit of not looking too closely at the hours being put in elsewhere. You want the home front to be stable. You need it to be stable. So you accept the explanations that allow it to stay stable and you keep moving. I wish I had paid closer attention. Because the gym was only the beginning. The phone came next. Danielle had never been secretive about her phone. We weren't that couple. We didn't have each other's passwords written down somewhere. But we'd hand each other our phones without a second thought to pull up a restaurant address or skip a song. That casual openness had been part of the fabric of how we operated for 3 years. Somewhere in year 3 it changed. Small things at first. The phone placed face down when she sat on the counter. A new habit of taking it to the bathroom that hadn't existed before. The angle of the screen shifting away from me when a notification came through. A movement so practiced, I wasn't sure at first whether I was seeing it or imagining it. I was seeing it. I told myself I was imagining it. This is what I know now about the way a lie operates inside a long relationship. It doesn't arrive. It grows. It starts as something small enough to explain away, and it feeds on every explanation you give it until it has gotten big enough that explaining it away is the only coping mechanism you have left. By the time you stop explaining, it is enormous. It has been enormous for longer than you know. I kept explaining until February. The key card ended that. For 3 days after finding it, I watched her. I had never watched Danielle before. Not like that. Not with the tension that was really interrogation. But now I was watching the way she moved through the house, the way she held her phone, the way she said my name when she wanted something, and the way she didn't say it when she didn't. I was watching for the seams, for the places where the performance had gotten thin. I found one on the 3rd day. She told me on a Thursday evening that she had a work event Friday night. A client dinner. She might be home late, she said, in the particular casual tone of someone delivering information they have rehearsed. She said it while loading the dishwasher, not looking at me, which was either ordinary multitasking or the specific body language of a person who has learned not to make eye contact when they are lying. I said that was fine. I said it was fine, and I went to bed, and I lay there in the dark, and I thought about the key card and the gym and the phone and the client dinner, and I made a decision. Friday morning, after Danielle left for work, I picked up her phone. She had changed the passcode. I didn't know the new one. I sat with that information for a moment. A changed passcode is not evidence of anything by itself. People change passcodes. But this was a woman who had used the same 4-digit code for 3 years, her mother's birth year, and had changed it sometime in the last several months without mentioning it, without having any reason I could identify to mention it, without having any reason I could identify to change it. I put the phone down. I went to work. I left work at 2 in the afternoon, which I never do, and I sat in my car in the parking garage, and I thought about what I was doing and what I was about to do, and whether there was a version of the next 24 hours in which I was wrong about everything. I wanted there to be. I need you to understand that. I wanted to be wrong. 5 years is not nothing. A life built with someone is not nothing. The version of the future I had been carrying, the house we had talked about in Cascade Heights, the children that had moved from abstract to specific in our conversations over the last year, the whole architecture of what came next, none of that was nothing. I wanted the key card to be a work event. I wanted the change passcode to be a security update. I wanted the gym to be the gym. I stayed in that parking garage for 45 minutes. Then I went home. I knew Danielle's habits. I knew what time she would start getting ready for the supposed client dinner. I knew which bag she would take, which shoes she would choose, what the process looked like from the other side of the bathroom door. I had watched it hundreds of times without watching it. I watched it that evening with complete attention. She was careful. I'll give her that. The outfit was professional enough. The explanation, offered once more as she touched up her makeup, was delivered with the ease of someone who has said a thing so many times it no longer cost them anything to say. Client dinner. Downtown. Don't wait up. She kissed me on the cheek on her way out. I waited 12 minutes. Then I got in my car, and I followed her. What happened next changed everything. She didn't go downtown. She drove north. I stayed 3 cars back, far enough not to be visible, close enough not to lose her in Atlanta's Friday night traffic. She drove for 22 minutes, and she pulled into the parking lot of a hotel on the north side of the city. The same hotel name that was on the key card. I parked on the far end of the lot, and I sat in my car, and I watched her walk inside without looking back. Unhurried, comfortable, the walk of someone arriving somewhere familiar. I didn't move for a long time. There's a specific kind of pain that arrives not as an explosion, but as a settling, like something that was suspended finally making contact with the ground. I had known, in the way you know things before you let yourself know them, for longer than I wanted to admit. But knowing before you let yourself know, and watching your wife walk into a hotel on a Friday night, when she told you she was at a client dinner, are two entirely different experiences. One lives in the back of your mind. The other lives in your body. I got out of the car. I walked into the hotel lobby, and I went to the front desk, and I told the woman behind the counter that I was meeting my wife, and I had forgotten the room number. I gave Danielle's name. I said I had the reservation confirmation on my phone, but couldn't find it. She looked at the screen for a moment. She gave me a room number. I rode the elevator to the 4th floor. I walked down a corridor that smelled like hotel corridors everywhere. That specific combination of carpet cleaner and recycled air that exists nowhere else on Earth. I found the door. I stood in front of it. I want to tell you I was calm. I wasn't calm. My hands were completely still, and my face was completely still, and something in my chest was doing something I didn't have a word for. Not anger. Not yet. Something that comes before anger. The last few seconds before the thing you didn't want to be true finishes becoming true. I knocked. Silence for a moment. Then movement inside. Then the specific pause of someone checking the people. The door opened. A man stood in the doorway. Korean, late 30s, dressed like he'd been in the room for a while. He looked at me the way people look at someone they were not expecting. His expression went through several things in a short interval. Confusion first, then a realization moving across his face that told me he knew exactly who I was, which meant Danielle had told him about me, which was its own kind of information. Behind him, further back in a room, I heard her voice. Who is it? He didn't answer her. He looked at me, and he said, nothing, and I looked at him, and I said, nothing, and in that silence, everything that needed to be communicated was communicated. Then Danielle appeared behind him. She saw me. The color left her face in a way I had never seen before and have not seen since. Not guilt exactly. Something beyond guilt. The specific expression of someone watching the architecture of their double life make contact with itself. She said my name, just my name, once in a voice that had lost all the practiced ease of the last several months. I didn't say anything. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I turned around and I walked back down the corridor and I rode the elevator down to the lobby and I walked out into the Atlanta night and I got in my car. That's when everything made sense. All of it. The gym, the phone, the key card that fell out of her coat pocket like it was tired of being hidden. Every explanation I had accepted. Everything I had decided not to say. Every morning, I had woken up next to a woman who was keeping a version of her life from me that was apparently detailed enough that the man in that hotel room knew my name. I drove home. I sat in our apartment, and I looked at the life we had assembled, the furniture we had chosen together, the photographs on the walls, the evidence of 5 years of shared construction, and I felt nothing that resembled what I expected to feel. Not the explosive grief of a man whose marriage has just ended. Something quieter than that. Something that felt almost like the relief of a question finally answered, which was worse in some ways than the grief would have been. She came home 40 minutes later. I was sitting in the living room in the dark when she walked in. She turned on the light and saw me and stopped moving. She was still dressed the same way she'd left. Her makeup was slightly less perfect than it had been. She was holding her phone with both hands the way people hold things when they need something to hold. She started talking immediately. This is what I noticed. She had a prepared version. Some of it, anyway. The beginning of an explanation that had clearly been assembled in the car on the way home. Partial truths, reframings, the kind of language designed to create enough ambiguity that a conversation can be redirected. She was good at language. She had always been good at language. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching her recalibrate in real time when she realized the prepared version wasn't landing. When she saw that I wasn't asking questions, wasn't raising my voice, wasn't giving her anything to work with. I just sat there and let her talk and watched her hear herself and watched the explanation getting smaller and smaller the more she said. She stopped talking. The room was quiet. I asked her one question. How long? She looked at the floor. 8 months, she said. 8 months. The gym, the phone, the key card. 8 months of a parallel life running inside our apartment, inside our marriage, inside the version of the future I've been building in my head. 8 months of a woman I had trusted completely managing two entirely separate realities without. And this is what stayed with me. This is what I still think about, without apparent difficulty. Without the seams showing. Without losing her composure at the breakfast table, or in the car on Sunday mornings, or in any of the hundreds of ordinary moments we had shared across those 8 months. That required a level of compartmentalization I hadn't known she was capable of. Learning that about someone you've shared a bed with for 5 years is its own particular education. I told her to get her things. Not her everything. I wasn't going to do this in one night. The logistics of 5 years don't collapse in a single conversation, but enough. Enough for wherever she was going tonight. I told her she needed to leave, and we would handle the rest through whatever process came next. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she asked me, and I want you to understand that this happened, that a real person asked this question in this situation. She asked me if I wanted to talk about it. I told her there was nothing to talk about. She started to say something else. I stood up and I walked to the bedroom, and I closed the door, and I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I listened to her move around the apartment for 20 minutes. Drawers opening, the bathroom, the closet, the specific sounds of a person collecting themselves from a place they are leaving. The front door closed at 11:14. I know the exact time because I looked at my phone when I heard it. 11:14 on a Friday night in February. The specific moment my marriage ended without a single raised voice. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark and I thought about 8 months. About the evenings, she'd come home from the gym with wet hair that didn't smell like a gym. About the client dinners and the work events and the explanations I had accepted without examination because I was busy and because I trusted her, and because when you build a life around a person you develop, almost as a survival mechanism, a practiced incapacity to see the things that would require you to tear it down. I thought about the man in the hotel doorway, his expression when he saw me, the realization moving across his face, the fact that she had told him enough about me that he recognized me on sight. I wondered what version of me she had given him. I wondered what version of our marriage she had described to make what she was doing feel acceptable to herself. Because people who do what Danielle did always have version. A narrative in which they are not the villain. A set of justifications built carefully enough to live inside. I wondered what hers looked like from the inside. I stopped wondering about it eventually. It didn't matter. What she had told him about me. What she had told herself. The architecture of her justifications. None of it had anything to do with what was true. And what was true was simple. She had made a choice repeatedly across 8 months in full knowledge of what she was doing and what it would cost if it was discovered. She had made that choice, and she had made it again the next day and the day after that. And the version of me that existed in her mind while she was making it was apparently not sufficient reason to stop. That told me everything I needed to know about what I had actually been to her. The divorce process started 3 weeks later. I won't go into the details because the details are mostly logistics, property, accounts, the particular exhaustion of dismantling shared infrastructure with someone you no longer trust. We handled it through lawyers. We did not have long conversations. We did not attempt the kind of closure that people sometimes attempt in these situations, the final accounting of what went wrong and who is responsible for which portion of it. There was nothing to account for. She knew what she had done. I knew what she had done. The lawyers knew enough to finish it. What I will tell you is what I found out 3 months later. Not because I went looking for it, but because Atlanta is not as large a city as it sometimes feels, and because the specific community Danielle and I had moved through for 5 years had a memory. A mutual friend told me, over dinner, with the careful tone of someone delivering information they believe you need, even though delivering it is uncomfortable, the Korean man had ended it. Not when I showed up at the hotel door. Before that, apparently, or around that time. The timeline was unclear and ultimately irrelevant. What was clear was that whatever Danielle had believed she was building with him, whatever version of a future she had been running alongside ours, he had not been building the same thing. He had moved on. He had, by the time this information reached me, left Atlanta entirely. She had burned down her marriage for something that was already over on his end before the smoke cleared. I want to tell you, I felt something when I heard that. satisfaction, maybe the specific vindication of a person who has been wronged watching the wrong rebound. I didn't feel that. What I felt was closer to nothing. A clean, flat nothing that I have come to understand is not emptiness, but clarity. When you have fully processed a thing, when you have sat with it in the dark long enough that it has given up everything it has to give, there is no satisfaction left in its consequences. There is just the acknowledgement that it happened, and that it is over, and that what comes next has nothing to do with it. Danielle called me once, about 4 months after the divorce was finalized. I let go to voicemail. She left a message that I listened to once and deleted. I don't remember exactly what it said. Something about closure. Something about wanting me to understand. The language of a person who has processed their own guilt to the point where they need an audience for the resolution. I wasn't available to be that audience. I have thought about those 5 years more times than I can count. Not obsessively. Not with the kind of backward-looking grief that keeps a person anchored to something that is finished. More the way you think about anything that shaped you, with a kind of clear-eyed inventory, taking stock of what was real and what was constructed and what the difference between those two things cost you. Here is what I know now that I didn't know then. Trust is not the same thing as certainty. I had confused them for most of my marriage. I had trusted Danielle completely, and I had mistaken that trust for knowledge. Had believed that trusting her meant I knew her, that the version of herself she had given me was the whole version, that the life we were building together was the same life she was building. It wasn't. She was building something else at the same time, on the same foundation, with materials I didn't know she had. That's not something you can protect yourself against entirely. You can't audit the people you love. You can't verify a person's interior life against some external record. What you can do, what I have learned to do, slowly, with more difficulty than I expected, is stay present in your own life. Pay attention not just when something feels wrong, but when something feels too right. When the ease of a long relationship starts to feel less like comfort and more like complacency. I'm not the same man who stood in that hotel corridor. That man believed that the life he had built was solid because nothing had broken yet. He had confused the absence of visible damage for structural integrity. He had invested so completely in the story of his marriage that examining it too closely felt like a threat to the investment. I don't make that mistake anymore. I live in a different part of Atlanta now. Smaller place. Mine, in every sense. The mornings are quiet in a way I have come to prefer over the alternative. The specific quiet of a space that contains exactly what you put in it and nothing else. Some mornings that feels like loss. Most mornings it feels like something else. There's a version of this story in which I am a man defined by what was done to him. Who I was before that hotel door, what I lost when it opened, who I became in the months of paperwork and silence that followed. That version exists. I felt it, but it's not the version I choose to carry. What I carry instead is simpler. I follow my wife's messages to a hotel on a Friday night in February. A Korean man opened the door, and everything I built my life around turned out to be built on something that was never as solid as I believed. That's not a tragedy. That's information. And I have learned, slowly and at considerable cost, to be grateful for information, no matter what door it comes through.
What happens when professional gold digger meets a man with absolutely nothing to lose? I crafted the perfect facade of a billionaire lifestyle just to watch her calculated charm crumble into pure desperation. The ink is dry on our certificate, and she's just realized her dream life is actually a nightmare. Let me tell you how I built the trap, and how perfectly she walked into it. My name is Daniel, and about 2 years ago, I was the kind of man that women like Vanessa don't look at twice. Not because I was unattractive, not because I was unintelligent, but because I drove a 4-year-old Honda Civic, rented a 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building with a broken elevator, and worked as a mid-level financial analyst at a firm that would never make the cover of any magazine. I made decent money, comfortable money even, but nothing that would ever register on the radar of a woman whose entire life strategy was built around finding someone else's wealth and making it her own. I knew women like Vanessa existed, I had heard the stories. I had seen the cautionary tales play out in my extended circle. A college friend who spent 3 years with a woman who drained his savings and disappeared when the account ran dry. A cousin whose brief marriage to a woman he'd met at a yacht party ended when she discovered his family's estate was actually a modest farmhouse in rural Georgia that his grandfather had left heavily mortgaged. I knew the type existed. What I didn't know, couldn't have predicted, was that I would one day decide to become the bait. The idea didn't come from malice. It came from a funeral. My Uncle Gerald passed away in spring, 18 months before any of this began. Uncle Gerald was a family myth. The one who had actually made it genuinely and substantially in commercial real estate across 3 states. He had no children. He had 2 ex-wives who had signed ironclad prenuptials. And he had one nephew, me, whom he had quietly, without any announcement, named the primary beneficiary in the estate valued at just under $4 million. I didn't find out until the will was read. I sat in a lawyer's office in a suit I had worn to 3 job interviews and heard a number that didn't feel like it belonged to my life. I didn't tell anyone, not my co-workers, not my friends, not the woman I had been casually dating at the time, who I stopped seeing 2 weeks later for entirely unrelated reasons. I sat with this information alone for 6 months, watching the money sit in a trust account, trying to figure out what kind of man I wanted to be when I finally decided to use it. And then I met Vanessa, and I decided to spend a small fraction of it on the most expensive social experiment of my life. I need be precise about who Vanessa was, because this story doesn't work unless you understand that she was not a confused woman who made bad choices. She was a professional, skilled, deliberate, and experienced in a way that would have been genuinely impressive if it had been directed at anything legitimate. I first encountered her at a charity gala I attended with a colleague who had 2 tickets and no one to bring. I was there under false pretenses in the mildest sense. I was not a donor. I was a +1 in a rented tuxedo, standing near the bar because the past appetizers were better near the bar. Vanessa was working the room. There is no other phrase for it. She moved through that event the way a chess player moves pieces. With intention, with assessment, with the unhurried confidence of someone who has done this many times and knows exactly what they're looking for. She was stunning. I want to be honest about that because pretending otherwise would be dishonest and also would underestimate her. Vanessa was the kind of beautiful that came with maintenance, precise, expensive, deliberate maintenance that communicated to anyone paying attention that significant resources had been invested in the presentation. Her dress was not the most expensive in the room, but it was fitted with the precision of something custom. Her hair was perfect in a way that looked effortless and wasn't. Her jewelry was understated in a specific way that very good jewelry is understated. Not flashy, just quietly correct. She clocked me from across the room, and I watched her do it. That was the interesting thing about Vanessa. She was good enough at what she did that the assessment was nearly invisible, but I was watching specifically because my colleague had pointed her out earlier in the evening with a low whistle and the words, "That woman has been to 4 of these in the last 6 months, never with the same man twice." I watched her scan the room, and I watched her eyes move over me, and I watched the microcalculation happen. The fraction of a second in which you register the rented tuxedo, the off-brand watch, the absence of a specific relaxed entitlement that genuinely wealthy men carry in their bodies, and I watched her move on, and something in me, some part that had been sitting quietly with $4 million and 6 months of patience, thought, not yet, but soon. The preparation took 8 weeks. I want to be clear about the budget I allocated for this. I set aside $45,000, a number that felt insane to me at the time and still feels insane when I say out loud, but which represented slightly over 1% of the inheritance, and which I had decided, with the cold logic of a financial analyst, was the cost of an education I needed. I leased a Porsche Cayenne for 6 months. Midnight black, current year. The kind of vehicle that reads immediately and correctly to people who read vehicles. I found a furnished penthouse apartment available for a short-term luxury rental in the part of the city where the kind of money I was pretending to have actually lived. $3,000 a week, which felt obscene and which I paid without flinching because flinching would have broken the character. I bought 4 suits, not rented, bought from a tailor my colleague recommended. The kind of tailor whose shop has no prices displayed, because because if you need to ask, you have already answered your own question. I updated my watch. I updated my shoes. I created, with the precision of someone who spends a professional life analyzing financial presentations, the complete exterior of a man whose wealth was so established it had become invisible to him. I updated my social presence carefully, not flashily. That was the key detail that most people get wrong when they try to perform wealth online. Genuinely wealthy people do not post photos of their cars, or their watches, or their views. They post sparingly when they post at all, and what they post communicates access rather than acquisition. A photo from inside a members-only club. A weekend in a location that requires either connections or money to access. Nothing that screamed. Everything that whispered. Then I went back to the charity circuit, and I waited for Vanessa to find me. She found me in 3 weeks. The second time we were in the same room, I was different, and she knew it immediately. I watched the reassessment happen in real time. The portion of the valet line that she would have clocked on her way in, the suit that fit differently than a rented one, the easy familiarity I performed with the event organizer whose name I had researched in advance. I was standing with 2 people I had specifically cultivated for this purpose. Both genuinely successful, both willing to vouch for the character I was building, both in on enough of the plan to play their parts without lying outright. Vanessa introduced herself 40 minutes into the evening. The approach was elegant. I will give her that. She didn't manufacture a collision or deploy an obvious line. She came alongside me during a natural lull near the auction display and made a comment about one of the items, a piece of contemporary art that was objectively not very good, that was funny and specific, and indicated both taste and intelligence. She was not performing available. She was performing interesting, which is the more sophisticated play, and the one that works on men who consider themselves too smart to be played. I matched her energy exactly. I was not overeager. I was not indifferent. I was the specific temperature of a man who encounters interesting women regularly and is therefore neither desperate nor dismissive about it. We talked for 20 minutes. I mentioned once in passing something about the renovation delays on property I was dealing with, a property that did not exist, but which I researched enough to discuss credibly if pressed. I did not mention money. I did not mention the inheritance. I let the suit and the watch and the valet ticket do that work, because that is how it actually works at that level, and Vanessa knew it. She gave me her number before I asked for it. The next 6 weeks were the most psychologically fascinating experience of my adult life. Dating Vanessa was like being studied by a scientist who believed she was the one conducting the experiment. Every date was a data collection exercise for her, executed with enough warmth and genuine charm that a less analytical person would never have noticed. But I noticed everything, because I was conducting my own experiment simultaneously, and because I had spent 8 weeks preparing specifically to notice. The financial probing started on the second date, 3 days after the gala. It was subtle. She asked about my work with the specific vagueness of someone who doesn't actually care about the answer, but needs to know the category. I told her I was in private asset management, which was close enough to my actual background to be credible and vague enough to be interpreted generously. She nodded with a precise level of interest that communicated she had filed the information away. By the 4th date, she had found a way to ask about my living situation, not directly, but through the architecture of conversation about the city's neighborhoods that eventually required me to mention where I lived. When I described the penthouse's location, I watched something shift almost imperceptibly in her posture, a very slight relaxation, the body language of a woman crossing something off a checklist. She started reciprocating more warmly after that, more available, more tactile. The calls got longer. The texts got more frequent. She began what I can only describe as the installation process, the gradual, practiced introduction of herself into the rhythms of my constructed life. She knew which coffee I ordered. She remembered details from conversations weeks prior and deployed them at strategic moments to create the impression of deep attentiveness. She was, in the operational sense of the word, excellent at her job. The inheritance came up on the 6th date. I had planned this moment carefully. I did not introduce it. I allowed it to be extracted, because something offered freely is worth less than something discovered. We were having dinner at a restaurant that required a reservation 3 weeks in advance, and the conversation had turned to family in the way that conversations between people who are becoming something tend to turn to family. I mentioned Uncle Gerald. I mentioned that he had passed recently. I paused in a way that communicated grief. And then I said, with the specific discomfort of a man who doesn't enjoy discussing money, that he had left me something significant, that I was still processing what to do with it, that it had changed certain things about how I thought about the future. I did not give a number. Vanessa did not ask for one. She was far too skilled for that. What she did was reach across the table and put her hand over mine with an expression of such genuine seeming warmth and sympathy that I had to remind myself, sharply and internally, exactly who she was and what she was doing. That must be so complicated, she said. Grief and all of that responsibility at the same time. It is, I said. The warmth in her eyes was indistinguishable from real. That was the most unsettling thing about Vanessa, not the calculation, but how completely it was disguised. The proposal came from her, not directly, not with words, but it came from her in the way that certain things come from people who are skilled at making you believe you thought of them first. We had been together, officially, publicly, in the way that she had engineered us to be publicly together, for 4 months. The penthouse lease was coming up for renewal. The Porsche lease had 3 months left. I had spent, in total, somewhere between $38,000 and $40,000 building and maintaining the facade, and I had documented every cent with the habit of a man who tracks numbers for a living. Vanessa had, in that 4 months, met my friends, the 2 I had cultivated for this purpose, and several of my actual friends, who knew nothing about the inheritance and who responded to Vanessa with a spectrum of reactions that ranged from genuine warmth to a quiet, specific wariness that I noted and appreciated. My actual best friend Marcus pulled me aside after their first meeting and said, "She's incredible. Why do I feel like I'm watching a nature documentary?" I said, "Because you're perceptive." He said, "Daniel, what are you doing?" I said, "Something I need to see through." He looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Okay, but I'm on record." He was on record. The subject of our future came up one evening in the penthouse. Vanessa's 3rd time there. The first time she had cooked there, which was itself a calculated move, the domestic performance of a woman auditioning for a permanent role. She was in my kitchen in a silk blouse making pasta from scratch because she had identified early on that I found that kind of domesticity appealing and had filed accordingly. The pasta was genuinely good. That was the thing. Vanessa's performances were always genuinely good. She didn't do anything halfway. We were eating at the kitchen island, and she said, in a particular tone of someone raising something they'd been sitting with for a while, that she had been thinking about where things were going between us, that she wasn't someone who did things halfway, that she believed in building something real. I said I did too. She said that with everything I was navigating, the inheritance, the decisions about the future, the question of what kind of life I wanted to build, it might matter to have someone beside me who was truly committed, not just present, committed. I looked at her across the kitchen island with the pasta she had made from scratch and the silk blouse and the eyes that were doing the warmth they did so well. And I said, "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" She smiled. "I'm saying I'm not going anywhere. If you don't want me to." I proposed 3 weeks later, with a ring I had purchased specifically for this moment. Not an extravagant ring, because a man who had actually inherited for $1 million would not feel pressure to prove a ring. And Vanessa was smart enough to know that. And the ring I chose communicated exactly the right kind of quiet confidence. She said yes before I finished the sentence. We married 9 weeks after the engagement. Vanessa pushed with a shorter timeline in ways that were deniable. She never said, "I want to get married quickly." She said things like, "I don't want a long engagement. They always lose momentum. And I've always believed that when you know, and waiting just introduces doubt." All of it was reasonable. None of it was accidental. She wanted a certificate before I had time to think, to consult, to have conversations with people like Marcus who were on record. The wedding was small. I insisted on that, and it was one of the few things I insisted on genuinely. I did not want to perform a large wedding for an audience, and I did not want to spend more of Uncle Gerald's money on a ceremony than I already had on the entire preceding operation. 18 people. A venue that was elegant but not extravagant. A dinner that was genuinely good. Vanessa wore a dress that had cost $4,000 and looked like it had cost twice that. She was radiant in the specific, electric way of a person who has just achieved a significant goal and is experiencing the physiological response to it. She held my hand at the altar with both of hers. She cried during the vows, one perfect tear on each side, timed with an accuracy that I found almost admirable. The ink dried on the certificate at 4:47 in the afternoon. By 4:49, I had made a decision. We had agreed to spend our wedding night at the penthouse before leaving for a honeymoon I had booked. Nothing extravagant. A long weekend at a resort 2 states away. Comfortable, but not the European trip Vanessa had referenced 3 times in the preceding month with a specific casualness of someone planting a suggestion. We arrived at the penthouse at 6 p.m. Vanessa moved through it with the proprietary ease of someone who has just acquired something and is taking inventory. I watched her do it. I watched her run her hand along the kitchen counter and look out at the city view, and I watched her face doing the private calculation of a woman who has arrived somewhere she has been working toward for a long time. I poured 2 glasses of wine. I brought them to where she was standing at the window. I said, "There's something I need to tell you." She turned to me with an expression of open, curious warmth. I said, "The lease on this apartment ends in 6 days. A small pause. "Okay, are we moving somewhere else?" "I am," I said. "Back to my apartment. My actual apartment. 3rd floor, broken elevator, 1 bedroom." The warmth didn't disappear immediately. Vanessa was too controlled for that. But something shifted behind her eyes. A recalibration. Fast and almost invisible. "I don't understand." "The portion is leased," I said. "It goes back in 11 weeks. I drive a Civic. The suits are real, those I bought. But the apartment, the car, the lifestyle, that was a production. I produced it. For you. Specifically." Silence. "The inheritance is real," I said. "Uncle Gerald was real. The $4 million is real. It sits in a trust account, and I have not spent it. And I do not intend to spend on a lifestyle. I intend to invest it carefully over time, the way a financial analyst would invest it, which is what I actually am, a financial analyst, a regular one at a regular firm, who drives a 4-year-old Civic and lives in a walk-up." Vanessa set her wine glass down on the window ledge with precision that told me she needed to do something with her hands. "You need to explain what you're telling me right now," she said. Her voice had changed, not broken. Vanessa was not someone who broke easily, but the register had dropped. The performance was consuming more resources than usual. "I'm telling you that I watched you assess me at a charity gala 8 months ago and decide I wasn't worth your time," I said. "And then I built the version of myself that was worth your time, and I watched you hunt it, and I let you find it, and I let you marry it. And now I'm telling you what you actually married." The silence that followed was the most interesting silence I have ever sat inside of. Vanessa was not a stupid woman. I want to say that again because it matters. She was not stupid. She was, in fact, one of the more intelligent people I had spent extended time with. And I watched her intelligence work in real time as she processed what I just told her, running the variables, calculating the options, assessing the landscape of what was now her actual situation. "The inheritance," she said finally, "is real," I said, "and is mine, and will remain mine. I had a prenuptial agreement drafted, which I gave to your attorney 6 weeks before the wedding, which your attorney reviewed and which you signed. You may want to read it again." Another silence. Longer this time. "You did this on purpose," she said. "I did," I said. "Why?" I had thought about this answer for 8 months. I had rehearsed it and discarded the rehearsal and rehearsed it again. And in the end, the truest version of it was also the simplest. Because I wanted to know, I said, whether the woman I was going to spend my life with was interested in me or in what I represented. And I needed the answer before the question became permanent. Turns out the certificate is permanent, but the answer was what I needed. "This is insane," Vanessa said. Her voice had shed the last of its performance. She sounded, for the first time in 8 months, like a person rather than a presentation. The fury was real. The disorientation was real. For a strange moment, she was more human than she had been at any point since I had known her. "You cannot be serious." "I'm a financial analyst," I said. "I'm always serious about numbers." What happened next was not a dramatic implosion. Vanessa was too controlled for that, too experienced with high-stakes situations to simply detonate. What happened instead was a negotiation. Because of course it was a negotiation, because that was the language Vanessa spoke, the mode she defaulted to when performance failed. She wanted out. I had expected that. The prenuptial agreement she had signed, reviewed by her attorney, who I had specifically ensured was a competent one, because I did not want any ambiguity later, was comprehensive. In the event of a divorce within the first 2 years, she would leave with what she came with, which was a wardrobe, a lease on her own apartment that she had maintained throughout our relationship as a contingency I had noticed and found darkly impressive. And a Chanel bag I had given her for her birthday that I told her she could keep. She spent 2 hours in the penthouse that night, trying to find a way through the architecture of the situation I had built. I answered every question honestly. I did not gloat. I had decided before this moment that I would not gloat, because gloating would cheapen it, and also because Vanessa at the end of the day was a person, and the situation was already what it was. You spent $40,000 on this, she said at one point, having clearly done some of the arithmetic. 41, roughly, to prove a point. To answer question, I said, there's a difference. She looked at me for a long time, and then she said something I had not expected. She said, you're the most patient person I have ever met in my life. I said, I had good material to work with. Something crossed her face that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. It didn't complete. She picked up her wine glass on the window ledge, finished what was in it, set it back down, and said, I want the divorce. I know, I said. My attorney will contact yours on Monday. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. As cleanly as these things can be finalized, Vanessa received what the prenuptial specified, what she came with, and not $1 more. I received what I had set out to receive. The answer to the question I had spent $41,000 asking, was it worth it? I have thought about this more than any reasonable person should think about anything. The answer I keep arriving at is not the simple, triumphant yes that a satisfying revenge story is supposed to deliver. It is something more complicated than that. Vanessa was skilled at something real. The intelligence she brought to her particular pursuit was genuine intelligence, deployed in a direction that had probably made sense to her at some point. Maybe long ago, maybe in circumstances I knew nothing about, and had become a professional identity by the time I encountered her. I don't think she was born a gold digger. I think she became one. And I think the woman I briefly glimpsed in the penthouse that evening, when the performance finally dropped and she was just a person in a situation she hadn't anticipated, was someone worth more than the life she had chosen. I did not tell her that. It wasn't my place, and the moment had passed. What I took from it, the actual inheritance, beyond Uncle Gerald's $4 million, was a clarity about what I was looking for and what I was not willing to accept. I had built the most elaborate possible test of a person's character, and the result had been unambiguous. That clarity cost $41,000 in 8 months of my life, and I have decided, after considerable reflection, to consider it money well spent on a lesson well learned. I am with someone now. Her name is not important to this story. What is important is that she met me in my actual apartment with the broken elevator on a Tuesday evening when I was in a t-shirt and reading glasses with a spreadsheet open on my laptop. She stayed for 3 hours talking about things that had nothing to do with money, and left with my number and texted me that same night. I told her about the inheritance on our 4th date. I told her the number. I told her about Vanessa and the $41,000 and the whole elaborate architecture of what I had done. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is genuinely one of the most unhinged things I've ever heard." "I know," I said. "Did it work?" "Define work." She thought about it. "Did you get what you needed from it?" I looked at her across the table. No performance. No calculation in her face. Just a person asking a real question and waiting for a real answer. "Yes," I said. "I think I did." She nodded slowly. The way someone nods when they're deciding whether to find something admirable or alarming and have not quite landed yet. "Okay," she said. "Then I'll let it go." And she ordered dessert, and we stayed another 2 hours. And neither of us was performing anything that, in the end, was worth considerably more than $41,000. And I didn't have to build a single thing to find it. If you ever want to know who someone really is before it's too late to matter, sometimes the most honest thing you can do is show them exactly who you aren't. Let me go back to the beginning, because I skipped something important. The part where I almost didn't do any of this. There was a week, somewhere between we were reading and the decision to build a facade, where I came very close to simply living my life, depositing the money, investing it the way I knew how to invest it, moving into a slightly nicer apartment in a slightly better neighborhood, buying a car that didn't embarrass me at valet stands, doing all of it quietly, without performance, without any of what came next. I almost did that. I was 3 days away from doing that. What stopped me was a conversation with my mother. My mother is a woman who had been married to my father for 31 years. She is not a romantic in the conventional sense. She is a practical woman who grew up with very little and built a great deal through the specific combination of intelligence and relentlessness that I recognize in myself when I am being honest about where it comes from. She has opinions about everything and delivers them without softening, which has occasionally been difficult and is consistently one of the most useful things about her. I called her 2 weeks after we were reading. I told her about the inheritance. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Now everyone is going to want something from you." I said I wasn't sure that was true. She said, "Daniel, you are a good-looking man with $4 million. I am your mother, and I love you, and I need you to hear me. Be careful who you let close to you now. Money changes the temperature of a room. People will walk toward you that would not have walked toward you before. That is not cynicism. That is just arithmetic." I sat with that for 2 weeks. And somewhere in the sitting, the idea began to form, not from malice, not from a desire for revenge against a class of people, but from the specific anxiety of a man who now had something worth protecting, and no reliable way to know who was interested in him versus who was interested in it. Vanessa, when I encountered her those 3 weeks later, was not a random target. She was a confirmation of everything my mother had warned me about, arriving with almost comedic timing. And the decision to build a trap crystallized in the moment I watched her scam me and move on. I thought, I need to know. Before I let anyone close, I need to know. And so I found out. There is one more thing I want to say about Vanessa, because leaving her as a villain is easier than leaving her as a truth. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into her at an event, not a charity gala, a smaller thing, a fundraiser for a local organization. The kind of event where people show up in business casual and the wine is from a box in the back. She was there with a man I didn't recognize. She was dressed simply. She looked, and I noticed this because I was paying attention, because I always pay attention, less constructive than I had ever seen her. Her hair was pulled back in a way that was practical rather than strategic. She was laughing at something her companion had said, and the laugh was different from the ones I had cataloged over 8 months of careful observation. It was louder, less controlled, more real. She saw me from across the room. There was a moment, not long, 4 or 5 seconds, where we looked at each other across a fundraiser with box wine. And I tried to read what was on her face and couldn't entirely. Then she gave me a single nod. Small, unreadable. I nodded back, and we moved in opposite directions and did not speak. And I drove home in my Civic. The Porsche had gone back months ago, and I sat in my actual apartment on my actual couch. And I thought about what it meant that the most honest moment Vanessa and I ever shared was 4 seconds eye contact at a fundraiser after everything had already ended. I didn't arrive at a conclusion. Some things don't conclude. They just become part of what you know about the world and about people and about the extraordinary lengths that human beings will go to in order to avoid being seen clearly. I had gone to extraordinary lengths to see someone clearly. I had gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid being seen. In the end, we were not so different in that way, and that, more than anything else, is what the $41,000 actually bought me. Not revenge, not satisfaction, not even the clean, complete answer I thought I was purchasing. Just a complicated, useful, humbling knowledge that people are rarely only one thing, and that the most dangerous assumption you can make about another person is that you have figured out exactly what they are. I hadn't, entirely, and neither had she. That's probably the most honest ending there is. The trap I built caught exactly what I was looking for. What I found inside, it was more complicated than I expected. That's usually how it goes.
People always say love makes you do crazy things. I used to think that was just something people said to excuse bad decisions. I don't think that anymore. I know exactly what love made me do. It made me lie on an operating table at 34 years old voluntarily and let a surgeon cut into my body to remove a healthy organ so that my wife could live. I signed the forms. I passed the psychological evaluation. I looked the transplant coordinator in the eye and said, yes, I understand the risks. Yes, I want to proceed. Yes, this is my choice. And every single answer was the truth. I love my wife. I would have done anything for her. I'd do anything for her. And then, while I was still healing from the surgery that saved her life, I found out she was in love with the man who performed it. I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. I'm not a dramatic person. I don't yell. I don't make scenes. I grew up in a quiet house in Ohio with a father who believed that a man's composure was his most valuable possession. And somewhere along the way, I absorbed that completely. When things go wrong in my life, I go still. I get quiet. I start thinking. That's not a personality trait I chose. It's just how I'm wired. And it is the reason that when my world fell apart in that hospital room, I didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't confront anyone. I just started paying very close attention. And paying close attention turned out to be the most powerful thing I could have done. Her name was Natalie. We met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, seated across from each other by accident. And we talked for 4 hours while the rest of the table faded into noise. She was a high school English teacher. She had a laugh that started quiet and then completely took over her whole face. She had opinions about everything: books, local politics, which grocery store had the best produce. And she stated them like facts, not arguments, which I found both infuriating and completely magnetic. We dated for 2 years. We got married in September on a rented farm outside Columbus with 37 guests and a cake that was too sweet and string lights that kept flickering. It was the best day of my life. For 5 years, the marriage was good. Not perfect, no marriage is, but genuinely good. We owned a 3-bedroom house in a suburb called Westerville. I worked in supply chain logistics for a mid-sized manufacturing company. She taught 11th grade English and spent her summers reading and complaining about the heat. We had a dog named Chester. We argued about whose turn it was to do the dishes and whose family we'd spend which holidays with, and whether we should refinance the mortgage. Normal life, real life, the kind of life that doesn't feel like enough until it's gone. The diagnosis came when Natalie was 36. Focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, a condition where the kidney's filtering units scar over time until the organ stops functioning. Her nephrologist explained it calmly, the way doctors deliver devastating information when they've delivered it many times before. Both kidneys were affected. Dialysis was buying time. The real solution was a transplant. The real solution was a donor. Her parents were too old and medically ineligible. Her brother was a match, but had a condition of his own that ruled him out. Extended family came forward, 2 cousins and an aunt, and none of them cleared the compatibility screen. Natalie went on the national transplant waiting list, and we were told the average wait was 3 to 5 years. I watched my wife go to dialysis 3 times a week. I watched her come home exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I watched her get thinner and quieter and more careful with her energy, like she was rationing it. And I made a decision. I got tested. I didn't tell Natalie I was doing it because I didn't want to give her hope I couldn't deliver. I went to the transplant center alone on a Tuesday morning and submitted to the blood work and tissue typing and compatibility panels. I told the coordinator to contact me directly with results. 2 weeks later, she called my cell phone while I was in the parking lot of my office. She said the words I had been hoping for. I was a match, not a partial match, a strong match. She said it was actually quite remarkable given that Natalie and I weren't blood relatives. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I went back inside. When I told Natalie that evening, she cried for a long time. Not the grateful, overwhelmed kind of crying you see in movies. Real crying, the kind that has fear in it alongside the relief, because she understood immediately what I was agreeing to. She said she couldn't ask me to do this. I told her she wasn't asking. She said she was scared something would happen to me. I told her I was scared of something happening to her. We went back and forth like that for a while, and eventually she stopped arguing and just held on to me in the kitchen for a long time without saying anything. I remember thinking that this was what marriage actually was. Not the wedding. This. The preoperative process took several months. Psychological evaluations, medical clearances, consultations, scheduling. It was during this period that I first met Dr. Marcus Hale. He was the lead surgeon on Natalie's transplant team. Mid-40s tall, the kind of steady confidence that is either very reassuring or very arrogant, depending on your mood. He explained the surgical plan clearly, answered every question I had, and made me feel that Natalie's life was in capable hands. I appreciated him. I shook his hand at the end of that first consultation and felt genuine relief that he was the one doing this. The surgery happened on a Thursday in March. Natalie and I went in together that morning, side by side in the pre-op area with curtains between the beds, holding hands across the gap until the nurses came to wheel us in separate directions. The last thing she said to me was that she loved me. I told her I'd see her on the other side, and I went to sleep on a table, and they took a kidney out of my body. My recovery was uncomfortable but uncomplicated. Laparoscopic surgery meant smaller incisions, but there is no gentle way to remove an organ from a living person, and the first week was hard. I was in the hospital for 3 days, then home in bed, managing pain, moving slowly, sleeping a lot. Natalie's surgery had gone well. Her body was accepting the kidney. Her numbers were improving faster than projected. Dr. Hale described her progress as exceptional. Everyone around me was using words like miracle and blessing, and I accepted all of them because that's what it felt like. It was during the second week of my recovery that things started to feel slightly off. Small things at first. Natalie would come home from her follow-up appointments at the transplant clinic seeming lighter than she left. Almost energized, which I told myself made sense given how much better she was feeling physically. But there was a specific quality to her mood when she came back from those appointments. A brightness that faded when she looked at me lying in bed, as if she'd been somewhere that made her feel a certain way, and coming home interrupted it. I noticed she had started wearing a little more effort to those appointments. Not dramatically. Natalie wasn't a vain person, but her hair was done differently. She put on a nicer top. I told myself she was feeling better about herself as her health improved, which was also completely logical. I'm a logical person. I kept finding logical explanations. The thing that broke through my logic was a sound. I was in bed one afternoon, drifting between sleep and wakefulness the way you do when you're on pain medication, and Natalie was in the kitchen on the phone. The walls in our house are not thick. I couldn't hear words, just tone. And the tone of her voice was one I recognized. Low and warm and slightly hushed, the voice she used when she was talking to someone she wanted to be close to. It was the voice she used with me in the early years of our relationship. It was not the voice she used to talk to her mother or her colleagues or her friends. I lay there and listened to the shape of that conversation for several minutes, and I did not move. When she hung up and came to check on me, I was pretending to be asleep. She smoothed the blanket over my shoulder and went back to the kitchen, and I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling and began, quietly and methodically, to pay attention. Over the following 2 weeks, I learned what I needed to know. I didn't go through her phone dramatically. I didn't hire anyone or set traps. I simply observed because I had nothing to do but lie still and think, and I'm very good at thinking. I noticed the frequency of her clinic visits increased beyond what her medical schedule required. I noticed that when I asked about her appointments, she gave me information that was accurate but incomplete. She'd mention her lab results, her medication adjustments, nothing else. I noticed that Dr. Hale's name came up in her conversation with her friend Diane in a way that was slightly too casual, the specific casualness of someone who was being careful not to emphasize something. And then one afternoon, when Natalie had left for an appointment and I was moving around the house more than I was supposed to, I found a card. It was in the pocket of a cardigan she'd worn to the clinic the week before, left on the hook by the back door. A simple card, the kind you find in a pharmacy. On the inside, In handwriting I didn't recognize were 9 words. I won't quote them here exactly, but the message was clear. The message was affectionate. The message was from someone who felt something for my wife that a physician is not supposed to feel for a patient. I put the card back exactly where I found it. I went back to bed. I lay there for a long time, and I made a decision about what I was going to do, which was nothing yet. Nothing visible. Nothing that would alert either of them that I knew anything at all. Because I understood something in that moment that anger would have obscured. The situation I was in required patience, not reaction. I had just given my wife a kidney. I had medical bills and recovery ahead of me. I had a mortgage and a life and a future that needed to be restructured carefully, not detonated. So I put my feelings somewhere very deep and very cold, and I started planning. The next several months were the strangest of my life. I finished recovering. I went back to work. I resumed something that looked exactly like a normal marriage from the outside. I was attentive to Natalie, not coldly, not with obvious distance. I simply continued to be a reasonable husband because I needed her to feel that nothing had changed. She, for her part, was attentive back in the slightly guilty way of someone who is managing a secret. She cooked more. She asked about my day with more focus than usual. She suggested we take a weekend trip. We did take it. We went to a lake house in Michigan for 3 days, and she was warm and present, and I watched her and felt something I can only describe as a kind of sad clarity. The feeling of seeing something exactly as it is when you no longer have any investment in it being different. I had already spoken to a lawyer by then, quietly, a woman named Patricia who worked out of an office in Dublin, Ohio, whose name I found through a friend of a friend. I told her the situation in full. She told me what I needed to document and how, and what Ohio law said about the dissolution of a marriage in circumstances like mine, and what I was and wasn't entitled to. I left that meeting with a list of things to do and a timeline for doing them, and I began working through the list. What most people don't understand about silent exits is that they require more discipline than confrontations. A confrontation gives you the release of expression. You say the thing, you feel the thing, the other person reacts. A silent exit requires you to carry the full weight of what you know every single day while behaving as if you're carrying nothing. It requires you to sit across from someone at the dinner table and ask about their day. It requires you to say goodnight. It requires a level of self-containment that I think most people don't have and that I had and that I am not entirely proud of having because it speaks to a certain capacity for detachment that I don't think is entirely healthy. But it was the right strategy for my situation, and I executed it. By September, 6 months after the surgery, I had done everything Patricia had instructed. I had documented the relevant financial information. I had quietly opened a separate bank account and begun directing a portion of my income there, within the legal parameters she outlined. I had taken photographs of the card I found, which I had replaced and then found again weeks later in a different location, confirming Natalie was keeping it. I had a record of communication patterns and timeline inconsistencies that Patricia said was more than sufficient. I had also, carefully and without drama, begun to untangle my life for Natalie's in ways that were invisible from the surface. Changing beneficiaries on certain accounts, consulting with HR about insurance implications, understanding the exact financial mechanics of what came next. I filed in October. I did not warn Natalie. I did not have a conversation first. I did not give her the opportunity to manage the narrative or appeal to my emotions or invoke the kidney, which I was fully aware she might do, because people in desperate situations use whatever is available to them. I filed, and the papers were served on a Tuesday morning while I was at work by a process server who came to the house at 10 a.m. when Natalie was home. She called me 11 times that day. I let every call go to voicemail. I texted her once in the evening and said, I know about Marcus. I know everything. My lawyer's name is Patricia. Have her lawyer contact her. That was the entirety of what I said to her directly for the next 4 months. The divorce was not clean, but it was faster than most. Ohio requires no specific grounds for dissolution. Irreconcilable differences is sufficient. And while Natalie's lawyer attempted several times to introduce the kidney donation as a factor in financial settlement discussions, Patricia had anticipated this and handled it precisely. The kidney was a gift. It was documented as a gift. It was given freely and without condition, as the psychological evaluation I had passed confirmed. It could not be leveraged retroactively. Natalie's attorney pushed. Patricia didn't move. We settled in February. I got the house. She got her car, her retirement account, and a small settlement that Patricia had agreed to as a reasonable concession to accelerate the timeline. I got Chester. I was not expecting to feel as much as I did about getting Chester, but I did. He was sitting by the front door when I came home the evening the settlement was finalized, and I sat down on the floor next to him for a while, which is not something I would normally do, and he let me, which is the particular grace of dogs. Natalie and Dr. Marcus Hale were engaged by the following spring. I learned this the way most people learn things about their ex-spouses, through the quiet information network of mutual acquaintances. Someone texted me a screenshot of her Instagram announcement without comment, which I appreciated. I looked at the photo for perhaps 30 seconds. She looked healthy. She looked happy. The kidney I gave her was functioning inside her body while she posed for that photograph. And I am aware of how that sentence sounds, and I want to be honest. It made me feel something. It wasn't rage. It was closer to irony. The specific irony of having given someone the thing that allowed them to fully become who they were going to be without you. I did not comment. I did not reach out. I did not do anything with whatever I felt except file it somewhere and move forward. Here is what moving forward looked like. Practically, I stayed in the house for the first year after the divorce and then sold it because a 3-bedroom house in Westerville is too large for one person and one medium-sized dog, and I didn't need the reminder. I bought a smaller place, a 2-bedroom condo closer to Columbus proper, near a park where I could walk Chester in the mornings. I took on a larger role at work, which I had the bandwidth to do now that my evenings and weekends were entirely my own. I started running, which I hadn't done seriously since college. I was not trying to reinvent myself in the dramatic sense. I was simply filling time that had been freed up and discovering that I liked the person I was becoming in that space. I want to address something that people always ask when they hear a story like this, which is, do you regret donating the kidney? And the honest answer is no. And I want to explain why that's not as complicated as it sounds. The donation was not conditional on the marriage surviving. I did not give her an organ as an investment in our future together. I gave it because she needed it to live and I was able to provide it. Those two facts exist independently of everything that happened afterward. She is alive. The kidney works. Those things are true regardless of what she did with the life she was given. And I have decided that my participation in keeping her alive is something I own, separate from her choices. It belongs to me, not to the story of the marriage. I gave something extraordinary, and that does not diminish because she was unworthy of it. If anything, it says more about me than it does about her. What I do feel, and this took time to locate clearly, is a specific kind of grief for the person I thought she was. The woman I married, the woman I believed I was saving, was not the complete picture. There's a version of Natalie that existed alongside the woman I loved, and that version was capable of conducting an intimate relationship with another man while I was recovering in a hospital bed from surgery performed to save her life. I don't think she's a monster. I think she's a person who made choices that revealed her character, and her character was not what I believed it to be. Grieving a person who is still alive, grieving the version of them you love that turned out not to exist, that is a specific and underrated kind of loss, and it takes longer than people expect. I am 38 now, almost 2 years removed from the morning I filed those papers. Chester is older and slower and still positions himself directly in the center of whatever room I'm in. I run 4 days a week. I am good at my job. I have learned how to cook 3 or 4 things well, which is enough. There is a woman I have been seeing for about 4 months who knows the broad outline of what happened and has never once treated me like a victim, which I find both refreshing and important because victimhood is a frame I have consciously refused to put around my own story. I was betrayed. I responded intelligently. I rebuilt. That is the story. People sometimes want me to say, I hate Natalie, or that I hope the marriage to Marcus fails, or that I take some satisfaction in imagining her unhappy. I understand why they want that. It would make this a more emotionally satisfying story in a conventional sense. The wrong man finding justice in his enemy's downfall. But that is not what happened inside me. And I've decided to be accurate rather than satisfying. What actually happened is quieter and, I think, more durable. I walked away from a situation that would have destroyed a lesser version of me. And it didn't destroy me. And the proof of that is simply how my life looks now. The proof is the morning runs. The proof is the condo I chose for myself with no compromise. The proof is Chester asleep at my feet as I write this. The proof is that when I think about what I gave her, not just the kidney, but the years, the effort, the faith, I don't feel cheated. I feel clear because I know what I'm capable of. I know that when someone I loved needed the most extreme act of sacrifice available to a human being, I did it without hesitation. That quality belongs to me. She didn't take it when she left. She couldn't. The kidney is still working. I know this because her condition is a matter of medical record, and because we share, still, a small number of acquaintances who occasionally let information pass. It's been almost 2 years, and her numbers are good. The organ I gave her is doing its job. I find, to my own surprise, that I'm glad. Not for her sake specifically. For the kidney's sake, if that makes any sense. I'm glad the thing I gave is doing what it was meant to do. I'm glad the sacrifice was not wasted on a short story. Whatever she does with the life that bought her, whoever she gives that life to, whatever choices she makes inside it, the kidney itself is doing exactly what a kidney is supposed to do. I can live with that. I can, in fact, live with all of it. And that, in the end, is the whole point.
The night I caught my wife, I wasn't supposed to be home. That's the part that never leaves me. Not the image, not the silence that followed, not even the way my chest felt like it had been split open from the inside. It's the simple fact that if I had stuck to my pride for just one more hour, I would have never known. And maybe that would have been easier. But I didn't come home early because I was suspicious. I came home to apologize. It started with something stupid. It always does, doesn't it? A small comment, a careless tone, one of those arguments that doesn't even have a clear beginning. Just a slow buildup of tension that finally snaps. Her name is Vanessa. We've been married for 6 years. Not perfect, but real. We had built something steady. Routine mornings, shared groceries, inside jokes that no one else would understand. That morning, I broke that rhythm. She had asked me something simple. Are you going to be late again tonight? I didn't even look up from my phone. I don't know. Probably. She sighed. Not loud, not dramatic. Just enough. That sigh did something to me. Maybe I was already stressed. Maybe I was tired of work. Maybe I just didn't want to feel like I was failing at home too. What's that supposed to mean? I snapped. She looked at me, surprised. It doesn't mean anything. I just asked. You always do this. I cut her off. Every time I'm busy, it's like I'm doing something wrong. I didn't say that, she replied calmly, but her eyes had changed. I just miss you being around. That should have been my cue to soften, to listen. Instead, I doubled down. Well, I'm working. That's what I do. But would you rather I sit at home all day? The moment the words left my mouth, I knew they were wrong. But pride doesn't let you take things back. It pushes you forward. She went quiet. That kind of quiet that fills the whole room. Forget it, she said finally. Just go. And I did. I grabbed my keys, walked out, and slammed the door harder than I needed to. Work that day fell off. You ever try to focus when your mind keeps replaying something you wish you could undo? Every time I opened my laptop, I saw her face. Not angry, not shouting, just disappointed. That was worse. By noon, I wasn't even pretending to work anymore. I sat there staring at my phone, thinking about texting her. Sorry, just one word. Easy, but my thumb hovered over the screen and didn't move, because a part of me was still holding on to that stupid pride. She sighed first. She made it a thing. She could have just left it alone. That's how I justified it. But justification doesn't sit well with your conscience. It keeps poking at you. By 3 p.m., I gave up fighting it. I grabbed my keys, told my boss I wasn't feeling well, and left early. I decided I was going to do it properly, not just a text, not just a quick, my bad. I stopped at a small shop on the way home and bought her favorite chocolate. The one she always pretends she doesn't want but finishes in one sitting. I even thought about flowers, but it felt too cliche. The whole drive home, I rehearsed what I was going to say. I was wrong. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that. You didn't deserve it. It felt right. For once, I wasn't trying to win. I just wanted to fix things. I remember feeling almost relieved, like I was about to close the gap that had opened between us that morning. I didn't know I was driving straight into something that would tear it wide open. When I pulled into the driveway, something felt off. It wasn't obvious. Nothing dramatic. Just the feeling. Maybe it was because her car was there, but the house looked too still. No music. No TV sound drifting out. Nothing. I shook it off. You're overthinking. I grabbed the chocolate, took a breath, and walked to the door. It wasn't locked. That should have been my first warning. Vanessa always locks the door. Always. Still, I pushed it open. Vanessa, I called out, stepping inside. No answer. I closed the door behind me. My heart started to beat a little faster. Babe. Then I heard it. A sound from upstairs. Not loud, not clear, but enough. At first, my brain tried to misinterpret it. Tried to make it something harmless. Maybe she's on the phone. Maybe the TV is on upstairs. Maybe. Then it came again. And this time, there was no mistaking it. A voice. A man's voice. Low, close, intimate. Everything inside me went cold. For a second, I just stood there, frozen. Because once you accept what that sound means, there's no going back. I felt my grip tighten around the chocolate in my hand. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was pounding, slow, heavy, like each beat was trying to break through my chest. I started walking toward the stairs. Each step felt unreal, like I wasn't in my own body anymore, like I was watching myself move. Halfway up, I heard her, Vanessa, her voice, soft, familiar, and completely wrong in that moment. That's when something inside me snapped. Not anger, not yet, just clarity. I reached the top of the stairs and walked down the hallway. The bedroom door was slightly open, just enough. I pushed it. Time doesn't slow down like people say. It doesn't freeze or stretch or give you a chance to process. It hits you all at once. A single, overwhelming wave. She was there, in our bed, with him, sheets tangled, faces too close. A scene so ordinary in any other context and so devastating in mine. For a moment, no one moved. Then Vanessa saw me. Her eyes widened. Everything changed in an instant. Wait, she started, her voice breaking. The man turned, scrambling, trying to pull away, to cover himself, to disappear. But it didn't matter. The damage was already done. I didn't shout. I didn't lunge. I didn't even step forward. I just stood there, holding a box of chocolate, like an idiot. I was coming home to apologize, I said. My voice sounded strange, distant, like it didn't belong to me. Vanessa stared at me, tears already forming. It's not what it looks like. I let out a small, hollow laugh. That's exactly what it looks like. The man tried to speak. Look, I didn't know. Get out, I said. Not loud, not aggressive. But something in my tone made him move. Fast. He grabbed his clothes and rushed past me, not meeting my eyes. I didn't stop him. I didn't care about him. My world had already narrowed down to one person. Vanessa. She had pulled the sheet around herself now, as if modesty mattered. Please, she said, her voice shaking. Let me explain. I looked at her, really looked, and I realized something that hurt more than what I had just seen. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't a mistake that started today. This had history. Explain what? I asked quietly. How long? She hesitated. That was my answer. How long, Vanessa? 3 months. 3 months. While we were still laughing. Still eating dinner together. Still sleeping in the same bed. 3 months. I nodded slowly. Who is he? She swallowed. Someone from the gym. Of course. A stranger. Someone who didn't know her the way I did. Someone who hadn't built a life with her. And yet, somehow, he had replaced me. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said quickly. It started small and then you kept choosing it. I finished. Tears were streaming down her face now. I was lonely, she said. You were always working, always busy. I felt something rise in my chest then. Not rage, not exactly. Something deeper. So you replaced me? I asked. No, it wasn't like that. Then what was it like? She didn't have an answer, because there isn't one that makes sense. Not one that makes it right. I looked down at the chocolate in my hand. Crushed now, melted slightly from the heat of my grip. I placed it on the dresser. I bought this for you, I said. She stared at it like it was something foreign. I was going to say sorry. I continued. For this morning, her face crumpled. Don't. Please don't. But I guess I was the only one trying to fix things. That's not true, she cried. I didn't want this. I didn't plan this. But you did it anyway. Silence. Heavy. Final. I turned toward the door. Where are you going? She asked, panic in her voice. I paused, and for a moment, I considered it. Staying, talking, trying to salvage something. But then I realized something important. You can't fix something that the other person has already let go of, even if they haven't admitted it yet. I don't know, I said honestly, but I can't stay here. Please, she whispered, don't leave like this. I looked back at her one last time. At least I'm leaving, I said. I didn't stay and lie. That hit her. I could see it, but it didn't change anything. Nothing could. I walked out of that house the same way I walked in, except everything was different. The air felt heavier. The world felt quieter, like something inside me had been turned off. I got into my car and just sat there, hands on the wheel, not moving, not thinking, just existing. It's strange how quickly a life can change. One moment, you're planning an apology. The next, you're questioning everything you thought was real. I didn't cry. Not then. That came later. That night, I just sat there until the sun started to go down. And when I finally drove away, I didn't look back. People always ask what hurts the most in moments like that. Is it the betrayal? The image? The lies? For me, it was the timing. Because I wasn't coming home angry. I wasn't coming home suspicious. I was coming home ready to be better. And somehow, I was already too late. Weeks passed, then months. I moved out, filed for divorce. We spoke a few times, mostly about logistics. Each conversation felt like talking to a stranger wearing a familiar face. She apologized. A lot. Said she regretted it. Said it didn't mean anything. But that's the thing about actions. They always mean something, even when people don't want them to. I never asked about the other man again. He was irrelevant. The real damage wasn't him. It was the choice she made, over and over again. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that day, about how close I was to a different outcome. If I had stayed at work, if I had sent that text instead, if I had come home an hour later, would anything have changed? Or would I just be living in a lie for longer? I don't know, but I do know this. Catching her wasn't the moment my marriage ended. It was just the moment I finally saw the truth. And the truth doesn't always come when you're ready for it. Sometimes, it shows up the night you decide to do the right thing, with a box of chocolate in your hand, and an apology that never gets said. Good, because this kind of story actually gets stronger when it breathes. I'll continue and expand it into a full-length, higher-attention narrative, adding depth, backstory, emotional turns, and a more powerful arc. I didn't cry that night. That part always surprises people when I tell them. They expect some dramatic breakdown, some moment where I collapse in the car, screaming, punching the steering wheel, begging the universe to rewind time. But no, what I felt was worse. Numb. The kind of numb that makes everything feel distant, like you're watching your own life through a screen. I drove without thinking, without direction, just letting the road decide where I ended up. At some point, I parked outside a random convenience store. I don't even remember choosing it. I just sat there, engine off, staring straight ahead. And that's when the memories started. The problem with betrayal isn't just the act itself. It's how it rewrites everything that came before it. Suddenly, every moment becomes suspicious. Every laugh feels staged. Every "I love you" starts to sound like a lie. I remember the night we first met. It was at a friend's birthday dinner. I wasn't even supposed to go, but something pushed me out of the house that night. Vanessa walked in late. Simple black dress. No effort to stand out, yet somehow she did anyway. I remember thinking she looked calm, like someone who knew exactly who she was. We ended up sitting next to each other by coincidence. Or at least that's what I used to believe. We talked the entire night, about everything and nothing. Work, music, childhood memories, random opinions that didn't matter. There was no pressure, no performance, just ease. By the end of the night, I knew I wanted to see her again, and I did, over and over. Those early days were simple. Late night drives, cheap food that somehow tasted better when we shared it, long conversations that stretched into silence without ever becoming awkward. We built something real, not flashy, not perfect, but solid, or at least I thought it was. A car door slammed somewhere nearby, pulling me back to present. I blinked, realizing I had been sitting there for over an hour. My phone buzzed. Vanessa. I stared at the screen as it lit up again and again. Call, call, call. Then a message. Please answer. Please. Another. I'm so sorry. Just let me explain. I turned the phone face down because there are moments when explanations don't matter. And that was one of them. I ended up at a hotel that night. Nothing fancy. Just somewhere to exist without thinking. The room felt unfamiliar in a way that made everything worse. Because for the first time in years, I was alone. No Vanessa in the next room. No shared routine. No sense of home. Just silence. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally felt something crack. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a slow, painful break. And the tears came. Quiet at first, then heavier. Not just for what I had lost, but for what I thought I had. Because the hardest part wasn't losing her. It was realizing I had already lost her long before that night. I just didn't know it. The next few days blurred together. Calls from her, messages, voicemails, apologies layered on top of more apologies. I made a mistake. It didn't mean anything. I love you. That one always stood out. Because if she loved me, then what was all of that? I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I genuinely didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who has completely changed the way you see them? A week later, I went back to the house. Not to reconcile, not to talk things through, just to get my things. She was there, sitting on the couch like she hadn't moved in days. When she saw me, she stood up immediately. Her eyes were red, swollen. She looked smaller. "Hi," she said softly. I nodded. "I'm just here to grab some stuff." She hesitated. "Can we talk?" I paused, not because I wanted to, but because I knew this moment was inevitable. 5 minutes, I said. That was generous. Too generous. We sat across from each other. Same room, same furniture. But everything felt different. I ended it, she said quickly, with him. That night, it's over. I nodded. It didn't move me. I blocked him. Deleted everything. I swear. "Vanessa," I interrupted gently. "You don't have to prove anything to me anymore." That hit her. "I'm trying to fix this," she said, her voice breaking. "You can't fix this," I replied calmly. "Yes, I can. We can go to therapy. We can start over." "You didn't just make a mistake," I said. I leaned forward slightly, not angry, just clear. "You built something with someone else while we were still married." Silence. "I was lonely," she whispered again. "And I was busy trying to build a life for us," I said. She flinched. "I didn't know how to reach you anymore," she continued. "You were always working, always tired." "So you found someone who had more time?" I asked. "It wasn't about that." "Then what was it about?" She opened her mouth, closed it, because again, there was no answer that made sense. I stood up. I'm not here to argue. I said, I just want my things. Are you really going to leave? She asked, panic creeping into her voice again. I looked at her, and for the first time since that night, I felt something clear. Not anger, not sadness, just certainty. Yes. Tears rolled down her face again. We can fix this, she whispered. I shook my head. You can't fix broken trust with promises, I said, because the problem isn't what you say now. It's what you did when I wasn't looking. That was the truth she couldn't escape, and neither could I. The divorce process was quiet. No screaming matches, no dramatic courtroom moments, just paperwork, signatures, endings written in ink. We divided everything like strangers. Furniture, accounts, memories, all reduced to decisions. Who gets what stays, what goes. It felt clinical, like dismantling something that used to be alive. Months passed. Life moved on the way it always does. Slowly at first, then all at once, I focused on work, on rebuilding routines, on learning how to exist without the version of life I had grown used to. Some days were easier, some weren't. There were nights I still replayed everything. Not the moment I caught her, but the moments before, the signs I missed, the distance I ignored, the conversations we didn't have. Because as much as I hated what she did, I couldn't pretend everything was perfect before it happened. We had cracks, small ones, but real. The difference is, I was trying to fix them. She was escaping them. And that's where everything broke. About 6 months later, I ran into her, completely by accident, a grocery store, of all places. She looked different, not in a dramatic way, just quieter. When she saw me, she froze. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she walked over. Hi, she said. Hi. Awkward, polite, like two people who used to know each other. How have you been? She asked. Good, I said. You? She nodded. I'm okay. There was a pause, heavy with everything unsaid. I'm really sorry, she said again. I believed her this time, not because her words had changed, but because time had. I know, I said, and I did. She wasn't lying, but that didn't change anything. I think about it every day, she added. About that night, I looked at her for a moment. Then I said something I hadn't said before. I don't. She blinked, surprised. I thought I would. I continued. But I don't. That wasn't entirely true. I remembered it, but it didn't control me anymore. It didn't define my days. What do you think about? She asked quietly. I gave a small shrug, moving forward. And that was the difference between us now. She was still looking back. I wasn't. We said goodbye shortly after that. No drama, no lingering, just closure. Real closure. Not the kind people pretend to have, the kind you feel. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't back then. Catching her wasn't the worst part of that night. It was a turning point. The moment everything became clear. Painful, yes, but necessary. Because sometimes the truth doesn't come gently. It comes all at once. Uninvited, unforgiving. And it forces you to see things exactly as they are. Not as you hoped they were. Not as you believed they were. But as they actually are. And here's the part most people don't expect me to say. I don't hate her. I don't even regret loving her. What I regret is ignoring the distance when it started growing. Because relationships don't break in one night. They break in silence, in missed conversations, in small moments where connection should have been rebuilt but wasn't. She made her choice, a series of them, actually, and I made mine, to walk away, to rebuild, to move forward. But every now and then, I think about that version of me, walking up those stairs, holding a box of chocolate, ready to apologize, ready to fix things, not knowing what waited on the other side of that door. And I realized something. That man wasn't weak. He wasn't late. He wasn't foolish. He was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. Trying. And even though it didn't save the marriage, it saved something else. Me. Because I didn't leave that house as a man who gave up. I left as a man who showed up, who tried, who chose honesty over comfort. And sometimes that's the only closure you ever really get. So if you're listening to this and you're holding on to pride and you're delaying that apology and you're thinking, I'll fix it later, don't wait. Not because it will always save the relationship, but because it will save you from wondering, what if? I went home that night to apologize, and I walked away with the truth. And in a strange, painful way, that truth set me free. I want to tell you something about the woman I'm married before I tell you what she became when she thought the money was gone. Her name is Vanessa, and on the day I proposed to her, on a rooftop in New Orleans with the city spread out below us like something from a film neither of us could afford at the time, she cried. Real tears, the kind that come before a person has time to perform them. She said yes before I finished the sentence. She grabbed my face with both hands, and she said yes, and I thought, this is it. This is a person. This is the one who sees me, and not the version of me I've been working to build. I was 31 years old. I had been building for a decade, and I believed completely and without reservation that Vanessa loved me the way I needed to be loved. Not for the building, but for the builder. I was wrong, but it took me 3 years, one carefully constructed lie, and a performance that nearly broke me to find out exactly how wrong I was. My name is Nathan, and this is the story of the test I never wanted to run, and the results I never wanted to receive. Let me give you the context, because context is everything. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Cincinnati, the kind of place where ambition was either your escape route or your embarrassment depending on who you told it to. My father worked in logistics. My mother cleaned offices 3 nights a week on top of her day job. We were not poor in a way that makes the news, but we were poor in the quiet, grinding way that teaches you exactly what money means before you're old enough to earn any. I started my first business at 22 out of a spare bedroom. With $4,000, I'd saved working doubles at a restaurant for 18 months. It was a digital marketing agency, which sounds impressive now and sounded insane then. I lost money for 2 years, broke even in year 3, and by the time I was 27, I had 12 employees and a client list that included 3 regional brands with real budgets. By 30, I was doing well, not wealthy by the standards of the people I was starting to work with, but genuinely, sustainably well, comfortable in a way my parents never were, building towards something real. That's when I met Vanessa. She was working in event management, beautiful in a way that makes rooms rearrange themselves around a person, funny in the quick, dry way I've always found irresistible. We met at a client event I was running the marketing for. She was coordinating the venue. We argued professionally for 40 minutes about signage placement, and then she let me buy her a drink afterward, and we talked until the bar closed. I was gone from the first night, completely, stupidly gone. We dated for 14 months before I proposed. In that time, I noticed things, the way she lit up around affluence, the way her energy shifted when we were at nicer restaurants versus casual ones, the way she talked about money in a tone that suggested it was a moral category rather than just a practical one. I noticed these things, and I filed them away in a drawer I chose not to open, because she was warm when it counted and generous with her affection, and I had enough love in me that I was willing to negotiate with the rest. That was my first mistake, the one that made all the others possible. We got married on a Saturday in October. 80 guests, a venue outside the city, everything exactly as she wanted it. I paid for almost all of it, and I did so gladly because I wanted her to have the day she'd pictured. My mother pulled me aside before the ceremony and said, quietly, in the way she said everything important, "That woman knows the price of everything, Nathan. Make sure she knows the value of you." I told her she was being protective. That was my second mistake. The marriage, in its first 2 years, was good in the ways that were visible and complicated in the ways that weren't. We bought a house, my money, her taste, which seemed like a fair division at the time. She left event management and started a lifestyle blog that made no money, but cost a reasonable amount to maintain, and I supported it because I believed in her and because the amount was manageable. We traveled. We ate well. We had the life that looks clean and complete from the outside and has its pressure points on the inside like every other life. The pressure points, for us, were always about money, not the spending of it. Vanessa was creative and enthusiastic in that department. But the discussion of it, she didn't want to know the mechanics. She wanted to know the outcome. She wanted to know that it was there, that it would continue to be there, that the life we were living was not contingent on anything as unstable as effort or circumstance. I told myself this was understandable, that she'd grown up with less stability than she'd let on, and that the desire for security was human and not mercenary. The thing that finally cracked the drawer open was a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. Vanessa was on the phone with her friend Danielle, a woman I had always found slightly exhausting in a way that people are exhausting when they're performing a version of themselves for an audience they haven't identified yet. I was in the kitchen, and they were in the living room, and Vanessa didn't know I'd come back inside. Danielle was apparently going through a rough patch with her own husband, and Vanessa was advising her. I caught the tail end of it. I heard Vanessa say, with the casual confidence of a person stating something they have never examined because they have never needed to, the moment a man can't provide the life he promised, he's already broken the deal. You didn't sign up to struggle. None of us did. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then I put my keys back on the counter and sat down and began, very quietly, to think. I want to be honest about what I was doing when I decided to run the test. I wasn't being noble. I wasn't conducting some controlled experiment in the service of truth. I was a man who had just heard something that put language to a fear he'd been carrying for 2 years. And I needed to know if the fear was real or if I was catastrophizing. I also want to be honest about this. I hoped she'd pass. I constructed the whole thing hoping she would prove me wrong. I told myself that if she came through it, if the woman I had married showed up when the scaffolding came down, then I could close that drawer permanently and never open again. She didn't come through it, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The plan took 6 weeks to set up. My business partner, a man named Theo who had known me since the agency's second year, and who I trusted with every part of my professional life, was the only other person who knew. I told him what I was doing and why. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I think you already know what you're going to find." I told him I needed to find it anyway. He understood that. What we did, legally and carefully with the guidance of my attorney, was restructure the visible surface of my finances. The business itself was protected. I wasn't touching the real structure, just the appearance of it. The personal accounts Vanessa had access to and awareness of were drained down to numbers that told a story of crisis. Assets were moved. The lease on my office space was allowed to lapse in a way she would eventually hear about. I drove the BMW to Theo's garage and started driving a 7-year-old Camry I bought in cash. Then I came home one evening in March, sat down across from my wife at the kitchen table we had picked out together at a market in Savannah, and I told her we had a serious problem. I told her the agency had lost its 2 largest clients in the same quarter, that a contract dispute was threatening a third, that I had been covering the gap for months without telling her, because I hadn't wanted to worry her, and that I had now reached a point where I could no longer cover it. I showed her the bank statements, the ones that reflected the restructured reality. I showed her the numbers. I told her we were going to be okay, that I was working on solutions, that this was a setback, not an ending, and that we would come through it together the way people who chose each other were supposed to. She sat across from me and looked at the statements for a long time, and then she looked up and said, "How bad is it really?" I told her it was bad, that we would likely need to sell the house, or at minimum refinance heavily, that my income for the foreseeable future would be a fraction of what she was accustomed to, that we were looking at a significant lifestyle adjustment for an uncertain period. She nodded slowly. She said, "Okay," and something in the way she said it, not the word itself, but the space around the word, the quality of the silence that followed it, told me that the test had already begun to answer itself. The first month was a study in subtlety. Vanessa didn't say anything cruel. She wasn't the kind of woman who operated crudely. What she did was quieter and in some ways more devastating. She began to withdraw in increments so small that each one individually was deniable. She stopped initiating, not dramatically, not in a way I could point to. But the warmth that had always been her most genuine quality began to operate on a thermostat I didn't control. She was present in the physical sense and absent in every other one. She started spending more time with Danielle. She began taking calls in the other room. She was never unkind. That was the part that required the most careful observation. She was never unkind, which meant there was nothing to confront, nothing to name, no behavior to point at and say, "This is what you're doing." It was the architecture of distance, constructed so gradually and so skillfully that a less attentive man might have blamed himself for it. I was a very attentive man. By week 6, I had also noticed something else. There was a man in Vanessa's extended professional circle, someone she worked with years before I met her, a developer named Christopher who had made significant money in real estate and who had a habit of appearing at events she attended. I had met him twice. He was polished, pleasant, and careful in a way that men are careful when they are interested in something they haven't decided to reach for yet. He began appearing more frequently in her schedule. A group lunch here, an industry event there. Nothing I could point to, nothing that would have constituted an accusation. But I had been paying close attention, and close attention rarely lies. I said nothing. I watched. The second month is when the conversation started. Not between us. We had stopped having real conversations by then, which itself was data. The conversations, were the ones she had around me, or near me, or occasionally directly at me with particular tone of a person who is testing the temperature of a room they are planning to leave. She brought up her friend Rachel's husband, who had just accepted a position in finance that had completely changed their situation. She mentioned this 3 times in 10 days, each time with an admiration that was less about Rachel's husband and more about the category of man he had become. She asked me once, over dinner, whether I considered going back to a corporate role. Just for the stability, she said, just until things settle. I told her I was an entrepreneur and that going backward wasn't part of my thinking. She nodded in a way that filed the answer away rather than accepted it. She called her mother more. Long calls in the bedroom, door not quite closed. I was not the kind of man who listened at doors, but I was the kind of man who noticed patterns. The calls increased in frequency across the exact same weeks that her investment in our daily life decreased. Month 2, week 3, I found receipt. Not hidden. She wasn't hiding things yet, just carelessly left in the pocket of the jacket. I moved from the chair to the hook by the door. Dinner for 2 at a restaurant I had taken her to on our first anniversary. The receipt was dated Tuesday. I had been at a meeting with Theo that Tuesday, a meeting she knew about, a meeting that had kept me out until past 9. I put the receipt back in the pocket. I sat with it for 3 days before I did anything, and what I did was not what she expected. I booked a table at that same restaurant for following Friday. I told her I wanted to take her to dinner, that despite everything. I wanted us to have a night that felt like us. She seemed surprised, a specific kind of surprise, the kind that contains a thread of guilt if you know what you're looking at. She said yes. We sat at the same table, probably, as whoever she had sat with on that Tuesday. The waiter recognized her. I watched his face when he saw her. The slight recalibration of familiarity that waitstaff perform when they're deciding how much to reveal about a previous visit. He revealed nothing. He was professional. But I had seen his face, and I knew what I'd seen. We had a pleasant dinner. Genuinely pleasant, which was its own kind of painful. Vanessa could be wonderful in the right context, and a nice restaurant was absolutely her right context. She was warm and funny and present in a way she hadn't been at home in weeks. I watched her across the table and thought about the man I had been when I first sat across from her in a bar and talked until closing time, and I felt the specific grief of watching a good memory rot from the inside. I paid the bill. On the drive home, she reached over and put her hand on mine and said, "I miss this. Us." I said I missed it too. I kept my eyes on the road. Month 3 was when she stopped pretending. Not dramatically. Vanessa was constitutionally incapable of drama. She was too controlled for that, which I had always respected and was now grateful for, because it meant everything she did was legible if you were watching correctly. She stopped wearing her wedding ring to certain things. Started with a yoga class. Rings come off for yoga, reasonable enough. Then a lunch. Then a Saturday afternoon that she described as running errands, and that produced no visible errands. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. I had already accumulated more information than I needed. I was simply allowing the picture to finish drawing itself. Christopher appeared at a mutual colleague's birthday gathering that Vanessa had told me about on a Friday, and then, that same morning, suggested I skip because I seemed tired and it would just be a bunch of people from her old industry. I told her she was right, and that I'd catch up on some work at home. I knew he would be there. I had seen the guest list. I sat at home that Saturday night and thought about the rooftop in New Orleans and the way she grabbed my face and said yes before I'd finished the sentence. And I thought about my mother's voice in the church anteroom saying that woman knows the price of everything. And I thought about all the times I had chosen to close the drawer rather than open it. Then I called Theo and told him it was time to end it. I won't tell you exactly how I ended it, because the ending matters as much as everything that came before it. I did not do it in anger. I had processed the anger months ago, alone, in the restructuring period, in the weeks of watching. What remained was something cooler and more purposeful. Not revenge, exactly, though I understand why it might look like that from the outside. It was more like the closing of an account, a final audit. I had Theo begin quietly reversing the financial restructuring. The accounts were restored. The assets reappeared. The BMW came back from his garage, from the outside, or rather from the inside of our house. Nothing changed on a Tuesday, but by the following week, if someone who knew what they were looking at examined the picture, the crisis would appear to have resolved itself with suspicious completeness. Then I did something I had been planning for 6 weeks. I threw a dinner party, not a large one. 8 people, carefully selected. Theo and his wife, 2 couples from my professional world who knew the real scope of what the business had become, and Vanessa's closest friend Danielle and her husband, because I wanted Danielle in that room. I wanted her in that room specifically. Vanessa was puzzled by the timing. She said she thought we were cutting back. I told her that sometimes the best move in a difficult period was to remind yourself and the people around you what you were actually building toward. She accepted this because it was plausible and because she had no reason yet to suspect what the evening actually was. The dinner was excellent. I had it catered. The wine was the kind that announces its price without stating it. Theo, who had spent months watching me carry this quietly, was magnificent. He played his part without being asked, talking about the firm's recent wins, a new contract that had come in, expansion plans we were legitimately considering. I watched Vanessa's face across the table. I watched the arithmetic happen behind her eyes in real time. The recalculation, the reassessment, the specific and unmistakable expression of a person who's been playing a hand they thought they understood and has just turned over a card that changes everything. After dinner, after the guests had moved to the living room with their drinks, I walked to where she was standing near the window, and I said, quietly, so only she could hear, "You should know that the last 3 months were a test," and I watched everything. She turned to look at me. I held her gaze, and I said, "I know about the dinners. I know about Christopher. I know what you said to Danielle about men who can't provide." I paused, and I know exactly who you are when you think the money is gone. The color left her face. I topped up her wine glass, because I wanted to be the kind of man who still did that, and I went to talk to our guests. The conversations that followed over the next 2 weeks were the quietest and most honest we had ever had. Vanessa did not deny anything. I had expected denial and was prepared for it, and she didn't give it to me, which was the first genuinely surprising thing she had done in months. She sat across from me at that same kitchen table, and she said, "I don't know who I became." I told her that I did. I told her I had watched very carefully, and that I knew exactly who she became, and that the person she became was not someone I had agreed to build a life with. She cried. She said things that were probably true. She said the financial stress had frightened her in ways she hadn't known how to process, that she had retreated into old patterns, that Christopher was a mistake she hadn't yet made but had been moving toward, and she knew it and she was ashamed. I listened to all of it, and then I told her that Patricia would be reaching out. I'm not going to tell you I handled all of this perfectly. I'm not going to tell you the test was a noble thing, or that I am proud of every part of how I ran it. What I'll tell you is that it was necessary for me, specifically in the specific shape of my particular doubt, and that the results were unambiguous. The divorce was handled quietly. Patricia was efficient and calm, and Vanessa, to her credit, did not turn it into a war. We divided what was fair to divide. I kept the firm and everything attached to it. She kept certain things that mattered to her, and some that didn't matter to me. We were both reasonable in the way that people are reasonable when the love has been replaced by something cleaner and less combustible. I moved downtown. High ceilings, clean lines, no furniture chosen by committee. Theo asked me once, about a year later, whether I regretted the test, whether I wished I had found another way to know. I told him there wasn't another way. Some things you can't know from the outside. Some questions only answer themselves under pressure. And the question I needed answered, not who she was when everything was good, but who she was when she believed it was gone, was not a question that had a gentler method. Do I think about her? Yes, less than I expected, and with less pain than I feared. I think about the rooftop in New Orleans sometimes. I think about the way she grabbed my face. I think about what it would mean if that moment was genuine, and what it would mean if it wasn't, and I've decided it doesn't matter anymore. Both versions are past. The firm is doing well, better than it has ever done, if I'm being honest, because there is something extremely clarifying about having every comfortable illusion removed at once. I work differently now. I trust more carefully. I have learned to tell the difference between a person who is present and a person who is performing presence. And I've learned it costs you nothing to be patient and let the distinction reveal itself. I don't rush anything anymore. Last week someone asked me if I'd ever get married again. I said I didn't know, that I hoped so, that I still believed in it as a concept, even if my experience of it had been educational in ways I hadn't signed up for. They asked me what I would do differently. I said, I'd open the drawer for the first time. I'd look at what was in it instead of choosing to walk past it. Not because love requires suspicion, but because the people worth loving can bear being seen clearly. The ones who can't, you find out eventually anyway. You just choose how much of your life you spend finding out. The BMW is back in the driveway. The Camry is gone. The catered dinners are back. Some nights I sit in the apartment and I think about that kitchen table and the night I sat across from her and told her we were broke. I think about the look on her face. Not the one that evening, but the one at the dinner party, when the card turned over and the arithmetic changed. That look told me everything I needed to know about everything. And the terrible and clarifying thing about the truth is, once you've seen it, you can never go back to the comfortable version. Not that I'd want to. Not anymore.
I need to tell you what happened before it's too late. Before whatever is happening to me finishes what it started. My name is Daniel. I'm 32 years old, and 3 months ago, I made the worst decision of my entire life. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought I was in control. I thought I was the one with the power. I thought wrong. My brother Marcus has always had everything. Always. We grew up in the same house, went to the same schools, had the same opportunities. But somehow, everything just worked out better for him. He was the football star in high school while I warmed the bench. He got the full scholarship to Stanford while I went to community college. He landed the 6-figure tech job straight out of graduation while I bounced between sales positions that barely covered rent. And then he met Vivian. I'll never forget the first time Marcus brought her home for Thanksgiving 3 years ago. She walked into our parents' house like she owned it, like she owned the very air we breathed. Vivian was stunning in a way that made you uncomfortable to look at her too long. Not just beautiful, that would have been easy to dismiss. She had this presence, this magnetism that pulled everyone's attention whether they wanted to give it or not. Dark hair that fell in waves down her back. Eyes so dark they looked almost black in certain lighting. Skin like porcelain. And when she smiled at you, really smiled, it felt like she was letting you in on a secret that no one else knew. My mother loved her immediately. My father couldn't stop complimenting her. And Marcus. Marcus looked at her like she'd hung the moon specifically for him. I hated it. I hated how perfect they were together. How she laughed at his jokes. How she touched his arm when she talked. How she looked at him like he was the only person in the room. It should have been me. I was smarter than Marcus, funnier, more interesting. But she'd chosen him, like everyone always did. They got married 18 months later in a ceremony that cost more than I'd made in 2 years. Vivian wore a dress that probably cost as much as my car. She looked like something out of a fairy tale, and Marcus looked like the prince who'd won the princess. I was the best man. I stood up there beside my brother, smiling for photos, giving a toast about brotherly love and eternal happiness, all while feeling like I was swallowing glass. The resentment grew over the next year. Every family dinner where they'd announce some new achievement, Marcus's promotion, the house they'd bought in an exclusive neighborhood, the vacation to Bali. And Vivian would sit there, perfectly poised, perfectly beautiful, perfectly untouchable. I started fantasizing about it around their first anniversary. Not love. I never loved Vivian. It was never about that. It was about taking something that was his. About proving that I could have what he had, that I wasn't always going to be the second choice brother. The opportunity came 6 months ago at a charity gala that Marcus's company was hosting. He'd been called away for some work emergency in Tokyo and couldn't make it. Vivian decided to go anyway. She'd already bought the dress, she said, and the ticket was non-refundable. I offered to accompany her. Just to be helpful, I said. Just so she wouldn't have to go alone. She accepted. That night, Vivian wore a black dress that should have been illegal. We drank expensive champagne. We danced. And when she looked at me, really looked at me for the first time, I felt like I'd finally stepped into the sunlight after years in shadow. You know, she said as we swayed to some jazz band playing in the corner, you're not like Marcus at all. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I asked. She smiled that secret smile. That depends on what you're looking for. We ended up back at my apartment that night. I told myself I was seducing her, that I was the one in control, that this was my victory over Marcus. But looking back, I realize now that Vivian was the one orchestrating everything. Every touch, every word, every moment. She was conducting it all like a symphony. It should have felt triumphant. I'd finally taken something from my perfect brother. But instead, as she lay beside me in the darkness of my bedroom, I felt a creeping sense of unease. Don't you feel guilty? I asked. About Marcus? She turned to face me, and in the dim light from the street outside, her eyes looked completely black. Guilt is for people who think they've done something wrong. Have you done something wrong, Daniel? He's my brother. And I'm his wife, she said, running a finger down my chest. But that's not what you were thinking about a few hours ago, was it? You were thinking about power, about winning, about finally being the one who has something he wants. She was right. That's exactly what I'd been thinking. How did she know? People are so predictable, she continued, her voice like honey and poison mixed together. They think they want love, or happiness, or success. But what they really want is power. The ability to take what isn't theirs. To prove they're stronger, smarter, better. Is that what you wanted? Power. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. Oh, Daniel, I already have power. More than you could possibly imagine. I should have asked what she meant. I should have gotten up and left. But instead, I kissed her again, and the unease faded into the background. We continued the affair for 3 months. Marcus never suspected a thing. He was too busy with work, too trusting, too confident in his perfect life. Vivian would text me when he was traveling, or working late, or at the gym. We'd meet at my apartment, or sometimes a hotel, and she'd make me feel like I was finally the winner. But the nightmares started after the second time we were together. At first, they were just uncomfortable. I dreamed that I was in a dark forest, calling out for someone, but no one would answer. I'd wake up sweating, heart pounding, but I'd shake it off. Just stress, I told myself. Just guilt manifesting in my subconscious. Then they got worse. I started dreaming that I was drowning, but not in water. In something thick and black and oily that filled my lungs and made me choke. I'd wake up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, my throat raw like I'd actually been screaming. Then came the dream with the door. I was in a long hallway, the kind you see in old hotels or hospitals. Doors lined both sides, all of them identical, all of them closed. But at the end of the hall was one door that was different. It was old, made of dark wood, with symbols carved into it that I didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to run, to wake up. But my body moved on its own, walking down that hallway, reaching for the handle. The door swung open, and inside was a room I'd never seen before. Candles everywhere, dozens of them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And in the center of the room was a woman. She was old, ancient, really, with skin like crumpled paper and hair that hung in thin white strands around her face. She sat in a chair, and her eyes, when she looked at me, were the same deep black as Vivian's. "The payment is due," she said in a voice that sounded like it came from deep underground. "What payment? I don't understand." "She borrowed power. Power requires payment. All debts must be settled." "What are you talking about? Who are you?" The old woman smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. "I am the one who gives what is asked and takes what is owed. Your brother's wife came to me 2 years ago, before she married him. She wanted everything: beauty that never fades, charm that never fails, a husband who would give her the life she desired. I gave her what she wanted. That's insane. That's not real. You're just a nightmare. Am I?" The old woman stood up, and suddenly she was right in front of me, though I hadn't seen her move. "Look at her, Daniel. Really look at her. Have you ever seen her look tired? Have you ever seen a single line on her face, a single gray hair? Have you ever seen her truly age at all?" I tried to think, to remember, but she was right. Vivian looked exactly the same as the day I'd met her 3 years ago. Not just well-preserved, completely unchanged. "The payment was simple," the old woman continued. 7 years of the life she desired, and then the debt comes due. She must sacrifice something precious, something she has stolen from another, a bond broken by betrayal. What does that mean? What are you saying? You, Daniel, you are the payment, the brother who betrayed his brother for her. The bond of family broken by lust and pride and envy. When the 7 years end, your life becomes hers, your years added to her account, your soul feeding the power she borrowed. I woke up screaming. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just my guilty conscience creating elaborate punishments. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. I started researching. I know how it sounds. Crazy, desperate, paranoid. But I needed to know. I looked into Vivian's past, her history before she met Marcus. There was almost nothing. Her social media only went back 3 years, right around when she and Marcus met. Her college records were sparse. I found a few photos, a couple of mentions, but it was like she'd barely existed before she walked into my brother's life. And then I found the article. It was buried in the archives of a small-town newspaper from upstate. 7 years ago, a young woman named Vivian Blackwood had been reported missing after visiting a local fortune teller known for practicing old ways. The fortune teller, an elderly woman named Margot Thorne, had died the same week under mysterious circumstances. Her shop had burned down, and Vivian had never been found. The photo of Vivian Blackwood in the article was identical to my brother's wife. I confronted her the next time she came to my apartment. I showed her the article, demanded answers. She just smiled that secret smile. "You've been having dreams," she said. It wasn't a question. "What did you do, Vivian? What the hell did you do?" "I took control of my life," she said simply. "I was nobody, Daniel. Poor, plain, powerless. I went to Margot because I'd heard she could change things. And she could. She did. At what cost? 7 years. 7 years of everything I wanted. And then I had to make a sacrifice. I had to break a sacred bond. Family, marriage, something pure corrupted by my hand. When the 7 years end, the person whose bond one broke gives me their remaining years. Their life force becomes mine. My blood ran cold. Marcus married you 3 years ago. That means I have 4 years left, she finished. 4 years before I need to complete the ritual. But here's the thing, Daniel. I didn't plan to use Marcus for the sacrifice. I actually care about him. Strange, I know, but he was kind to me. He loved me genuinely. I didn't want to hurt him. So you what? You used me instead. You offered yourself up so perfectly. The envious brother, desperate to take what wasn't his. When you seduced me, or thought you were seducing me, you broke the sacred bond of brotherhood. You betrayed family for lust and pride. Perfect sacrifice material. I backed away from her. You planned this from the beginning. The gala, the affair, everything. Of course I did. I needed someone connected to Marcus, someone whose betrayal would count. And you made it so easy, Daniel. All I had to do was look at you the right way, and you came running. I won't let you do this. I'll tell Marcus everything. I'll go to the police and tell them what? That your brother's wife is a witch who made a deal with a dead fortune teller? That you're being hunted by nightmares? They'll think you're insane. And Marcus, even if he believed you about the affair, what good would that do? It would just hurt him. The bond is already broken. The betrayal already happened. The moment you touched me, you sealed your fate. She walked to the door, then turned back. The dreams will get worse, by the way. As we get closer to the 7-year mark, Margot's spirit will start pulling at you, preparing you for the transfer. You'll feel yourself getting weaker, your life force draining. And when the time comes, you'll simply cease to exist. Your years will become mine, and no one will remember you were ever here. There has to be a way to stop this, to break it. Vivian tilted her head, considering. There is one way. If you can get another person to willingly take your place, to offer themselves as the sacrifice, the bond can transfer to them. But who would do that, Daniel? Who would die for you? She left, and I collapsed on the floor, shaking. That was 3 weeks ago. The nightmares have gotten worse, just like she said. Now I dream every night of that dark room, of Margot's spirit waiting for me. I can feel myself getting weaker. I'm tired all the time. Food tastes like ash. Colors seem duller. It's like the world is fading away, or I'm fading out of it. I tried to find another witch, someone who could break the curse. I visited every psychic, every fortune teller, every spiritual advisor in a 100-mile radius. Most were frauds. The few who seemed real took one look at me and refused to help. This is old magic, one woman told me, her hands shaking as she turned me away. Blood magic, life magic. To break it, you'd need power equal to what created it. And Margot Thorne was one of the strongest practitioners in 3 generations. No one can undo what she's done. I'm running out of time. I can feel it in my bones, in my blood. The 7-year mark is in 2 months. 2 months before Vivian needs to complete the ritual and take what she's owed. I thought about telling Marcus everything, confessing the affair, warning him about Vivian, begging for his forgiveness. Maybe if he forgave me, if we repaired our bond, it would break the curse. But I know it won't work. Vivian was right. The bond is already broken. The betrayal already happened. Forgiveness might ease my conscience, but it won't save my life. The worst part is the isolation. I can't tell anyone what's happening without sounding completely insane. My friends have stopped calling because I've become so withdrawn, so paranoid. My parents think I'm having a breakdown. Marcus invited me to dinner last week, and I had to make an excuse because I can't look at him knowing what I've done, knowing what's coming. Last night's nightmare was the worst yet. I was in that dark room again, but this time I wasn't alone. Margot was there, as always, but so was Vivian. She looked radiant, glowing with health and beauty, and beside her stood Marcus, his arm around her waist. But when I looked at my brother, I realized he wasn't real. He was translucent, a ghost, a memory, because in this vision, in this future, I was already gone, taken, consumed. And Vivian had gone back to her life with Marcus, her 7 years renewed, her power restored, and no one remembered that I'd ever existed. Time is running short, Margot's voice echoed through the room. The debt will be paid, one way or another. I woke up screaming again, but this time I kept screaming until my neighbor pounded on the wall and told me to shut up. I'm writing this now because I need someone to know what happened. What's happening? In case Vivian is right, in case I do just cease to exist, I need there to be some record that I was here, that this happened, that I was real. I thought sleeping with my brother's wife would make me feel powerful. I thought it would prove that I was just as good as Marcus, just as worthy of success and love and happiness. Instead, I gave away the only thing I truly had, my life. The irony isn't lost on me. I wanted to take something from Marcus, to steal a piece of his perfect life. But Vivian was never his to begin with. She was a borrowed thing, a conjured fantasy, a deal made with darkness. And I didn't steal her from Marcus. She stole me from myself. I've been researching constantly, desperately looking for a loophole, a way out. I found some references to breaking blood magic by offering something of equal value. But what could I possibly offer that equals my life? I have no money, no property, nothing of real value. Except, last night, I thought of something. Vivian said the only way to break the bond was if someone willingly took my place. Someone who would die for me. I don't have anyone like that. But Vivian does. Marcus. My brother loves his wife completely, utterly, without reservation. If I told him the truth, all of it, and if he somehow believed me, would he do it? Would he offer himself in my place to save me? The thought makes me sick. How could I ask him to die for me after what I've done? How could I compound my betrayal by asking him to sacrifice himself to save the brother who slept with his wife? But the alternative is my death. My erasure. My years stolen to extend the life of the woman who orchestrated this whole nightmare. I don't know what to do. There's a part of me, a dark, terrible part, that wants to do it. To tell Marcus everything and manipulate him into saving me. To use his love for me, his goodness, his inherent decency against him. To let him die in my place. It would be so easy. Marcus has always been the hero, the golden child, the one who does the right thing. If I present this as a choice between his life and mine, I know what he'd choose. He'd choose me. He'd save me even though I don't deserve it. And I'd let him. God help me, I think I'd let him. Because I don't want to die. I don't want to be erased from existence, forgotten, consumed by dark magic to feed a witch's borrowed power. I want to live, even if it means damning my brother to the fate I brought on myself. The nightmares are getting worse. Last night, I could barely distinguish between sleeping and waking. Margot's spirit is getting stronger, closer. I can feel her pulling at me, tugging at the edges of my consciousness. Sometimes I see her shadow in the corner of my room when I know I'm awake. Sometimes I hear her voice whispering in my ear, "The debt will be paid." I have 6 weeks left. 6 weeks before the 7-year mark, before Vivian completes her ritual, before I either cease to exist or convince someone else to take my place. I called Marcus this morning, asked if we could meet for coffee. He sounded happy to hear from me, worried about me because I've been so distant lately. We're meeting tomorrow afternoon. I still don't know what I'm going to say to him. I don't know if I'm going to confess everything and beg for his help, or if I'm going to keep lying, keep pretending, keep hoping that somehow I'll find another way out. But I'm running out of time, and I'm running out of options. Maybe this is justice. Maybe this is exactly what I deserve for what I've done. I betrayed my brother, broke our bond for nothing more than petty jealousy and a hunger for power that was never real. Vivian was right about one thing. I wanted power. I wanted to feel like I'd won, like I'd finally beaten Marcus at something. But I was just a pawn in someone else's game. A sacrifice selected and prepared and led to slaughter without ever knowing it. If I tell Marcus the truth tomorrow, if I ask him to save me, I'll be doing exactly what Vivian wants. I'll be confirming that I'm exactly as selfish, as weak, as pathetic as she thought I was. I'll be proving that I'd sacrifice my own brother to save myself. But if I don't tell him, if I just accept this fate, then Vivian wins anyway. She gets what she wants, and I disappear, and Marcus never knows what his wife really is. There's no good choice here. No right answer, just two paths, both leading to destruction. I keep thinking about that first night with Vivian, about how powerful I felt, how triumphant. I remember thinking that I'd finally taken something from Marcus, that I'd finally proven I was just as good as him. What a fool I was. Marcus never had Vivian. She was never his to take. She was a phantom, a constructed thing, a borrowed power wrapped in beautiful flesh. And I didn't take anything from him. I gave everything to her. My dignity, my honor, my brotherly bond, my very life. All of it sacrificed on the altar of my own insecurities and jealousies. All of it handed over willingly by a man who thought he was seizing power when he was really just opening the door to his own destruction. The worst part is that I can't even hate Vivian. She told me exactly what she was doing. She didn't hide it or lie about it. She just gave me enough rope to hang myself and watched as I tied the noose. People are so predictable, she'd said that first night. They think they want love, or happiness, or success. But what they really want is power. She was right. That's exactly what I wanted. And the price for that hunger, for that pride, is my life. Tomorrow I'll meet Marcus for coffee, and I'll make a decision about who I really am. Am I the man who owns his mistakes, who accepts the consequences of his actions, who refuses to drag his innocent brother down into the darkness he created? Or am I the man who does whatever it takes to survive, even if it means sacrificing the one person who's always believed in me, who's always loved me despite everything? I don't know yet. God help me. I honestly don't know. But I have 6 weeks to figure it out. 6 weeks before Margot's spirit comes to collect what's owed. 6 weeks before I either cease to exist or damn my brother to die in my place. The nightmares are waiting. They're always waiting now. I can feel them at the edges of my mind, even when I'm awake, pulling at me, dragging me down into that dark room where Margot sits and waits and smiles with too many teeth. The debt will be paid, she whispers. One way or another, the debt will be paid. I just have to decide who's going to pay it. If you're reading this, if I'm already gone, know that I was real. I existed. I made terrible choices driven by terrible emotions, but I was here. And if Marcus is the one reading this, if I went through with it, if I asked you to save me and you said yes, I'm sorry. God, Marcus, I'm so sorry. You deserved better than a brother like me. You always did. The coffee shop is 3 blocks from here. Marcus will be there in 20 minutes, probably already ordered my favorite drink, probably smiling and ready to help me with whatever I need because that's who he is. That's who he's always been. I'm getting up now. I'm walking out the door. And in 20 minutes, I'll know what kind of man I really am. I'll know if I'm the brother who confesses and accepts his fate, or if I'm the brother who asks Marcus to die in his place. The nightmares are getting louder. Margot's voice is in my head, counting down the days, the hours, the minutes until the debt comes due. 6 weeks, 42 days, 1,008 hours. And then one way or another, everything ends. I thought sleeping with my brother's wife would make me feel powerful. Instead, it cost me everything, including, possibly, my soul.
The night I found out, I was standing in my own kitchen holding a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. My wife, the woman I had loved for 6 years, the woman I had built everything with, was sitting at the table, and she wasn't crying. That was the part that destroyed me. She wasn't crying. She was just looking at me with those steady gray eyes like she was waiting for a verdict she had already rehearsed accepting. She said my brother's name, and then she said the words that came after it. And the cup hit the floor before I even knew my hand had let go of it. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of the story. I am not a man who falls apart easily. I grew up in a back-to-back terrace on Inkerman Street in Coventry, the kind with a shared yard and a tin bath you dragged in on Fridays and a privy at the bottom of the garden that froze solid every January. My father came back from the First War a quieter man than he had left, and what the First War hadn't taken from him the Foundry finished off, and he was gone before I was 11. My brother Robert was 9. My mother took in washing and later found work at the munitions factory on the Canal Road, and she kept us fed and shod and never once let on how close to the edge we were, because letting on was not something women of her generation did. You did not make a scene on Inkerman Street. You did not break things. You cleaned up the mess and you kept going. So when I say the cup hit the floor, what I really mean is that something in me broke so quietly and so completely that the only evidence was the sound of it on the flagstone and the spreading dark stain of tea across the kitchen floor my wife had scrubbed that same morning. Her name is Margaret, my wife, 5'3", dark hair she pins up at church and lets down on Sundays when there's nowhere to be, a laugh I can carry across a pub garden. She works the till of the cooperative on Spawn Street 2 mornings a week, and spends the rest of her time keeping our small house on Raglan Road in the kind of order that makes it feel larger than it is. I met her at a dance at the Coventry Hippodrome in the spring of 1946, the year after I came home from Germany. She was there with her friend Vera, and she stepped on my foot during a foxtrot and apologized 3 times, and I told her on the 4th that she owed me at least one more dance by way of restitution. She laughed and gave it to me. We courted for a year and a half, and I proposed on a Tuesday evening on the towpath along the canal, because I had saved up the ring money for 11 months, and I couldn't wait until the weekend. Robert is 2 years younger than me. He was too young for the Second War. By the time his papers would have come, he was working the reserved occupation at the Standard Motor Company, which suited him and suited my mother, who could not have stood losing us both. He has always been 2 years younger in every way that matters, 2 years less cautious, 2 years less patient, 2 years less afraid of consequence. Growing up, he was a charming one, the one who could talk his way out of trouble with the schoolmaster, into a game of cards with men twice his age, out of a fight that was entirely his own fault. My mother adored him in that helpless way mothers sometimes adore the child who worries the most. I was a steady one. Robert was the one who made life interesting. We had found a rhythm in that, a way of being brothers at work because we each understood our part. He was at our wedding at St. Michael Cathedral. What remained of it? They held the ceremony in the undercourt because the nave was still bomb damaged and the rebuilding hadn't begun in earnest. He gave a speech that made the women dab their eyes and the men laugh into their beer, which is the hardest thing to pull off at a wedding breakfast in a church hall, and he did it without effort, which is Robert. He was at our housewarming on Raglan Road when we moved in the following spring. He had supper with us most Sundays. He knew which drawer we kept the rent book in. He had a key to the house when Margaret locked herself out, which she did twice in the first year. He had a key to our house. Let me say that again. He had a key to our house. Margaret told me everything at that kitchen table, and she told it to me in a way that was measured and complete, like she had been rehearsing the delivery for weeks, because she had. She had been carrying this for 4 months before she sat me down. 4 months, which meant for 4 months I had kissed my wife goodbye in the mornings, called in on my brother on weekends, eaten my supper in this kitchen, slept in this bed, and not known. For 4 months I had been the last man alive to know the thing that was most about me. It started, she said, during a long stretch when the factory was putting me on nights. I had been on the night shift at the Humber Works for 6 weeks running that winter. The firm had a lorry contract to fill, and the foreman wasn't shy about who he put on the unsocial hours. I came home at 6:30 in the morning, grey with exhaustion, slept until 2, ate whatever was on the stove, and went back. We barely saw each other. She said she was lonely. She said Robert came round one afternoon to return a tool he had borrowed from the shed. She said one afternoon became another. She said she didn't know how it happened, which is a thing people always say when they know precisely how it happened, but cannot bring themselves to describe the sequence of small decisions that led there, because naming the decisions means naming the agency, and naming the agency means naming the fault. She was 11 weeks gone when she told me. I left the house that night. I put on my coat and my cap, and I walked. There was no car. We didn't have a car and wouldn't until 1954. I just walked down Raglan Road and along the Radford Road and out past the allotments and across the waste ground where the Daimler Shadow factory had stood before they demolished it after war. I walked until my legs ached, and then I sat on a low wall outside of Rower Prefabs on the Tile Hill estate, the kind the council had thrown up in a hurry to house the bombed-out families, and I watched the dog cross the road and disappear under a gate, and I sat there until the cold came up through the wall and into my bones. I did not go to Robert's lodgings. I did not go to my mother's house. I walked home before dawn, let myself in quietly, and sat in the kitchen until the milkman came at 5, and then I washed my face at the kitchen sink and went to work. That is the kind of man I am, or was. I no longer know with any certainty. For 3 weeks I existed in a state that I can only describe as suspended. I went to work. I came home. I ate food I could not taste. Margaret moved carefully around me, giving me space the way you give space to someone carrying something they might drop. She did not beg. She did not press. She made meals and left them on the stove, and sometimes sat in the front room in the evenings with them mending while I read the paper, or held the paper without reading it, and we existed together in a silence that was not peaceful but was at least contained. I slept on my side of the bed because there was nowhere else to sleep, and because some part of me, the part one I'm not proud of, kept thinking that if I could get through the next hour, the next morning, something would clarify. Robert came to the factory gate on day 10. He had never done that in his life. One of the lads came to find me on the floor and said, "There's a fellow outside says it's your brother." And I took off my work gloves and walked out to the gate, and I did not look at his face. I looked at the road. I said, "You have 1 minute." He said he was sorry. He said it was the worst thing he had ever done. He said he had been in a bad way. And I did not dignify that with a response, because I have also been in a bad way. I came back from Germany in the spring of 1945, having seen things I will not describe here, and I was in a bad way for longer than I told anyone. And I never once did what Robert had done. He cried. Robert, who had not cried at our father's funeral, who had stood dry-eyed in the cemetery on the London road on a grey October afternoon with his cap in his hands. He stood at the factory gate and wept, and I watched the road and felt nothing. Or felt something so enormous that it collapsed into nothing, which is a different thing but looks the same from the outside. When he stopped, I said, "Go home, Robert." He went. He pushed notes through the letterbox for the next 2 weeks, folded pieces of paper with his handwriting on them, and I put them in the kitchen drawer without reading them, and there they stayed. Here's what nobody tells you about a betrayal like this. The ordinary life is the worst part. Not the shock. The shock is at least decisive, at least legible. What comes after is harder, because what comes after is ordinary life with a landmine buried in the middle of it. You are drinking your morning tea, and suddenly you are thinking about it. You are on the factory floor, and you lose the count on the gauge because your mind has gone somewhere you didn't send it. You are fine, and then you are not fine, and then you are fine again. And the cycling between those two states is exhausting in a way that leaves no mark on your face and that nobody around you can see. Margaret began to show at 5 months. There was a specific Tuesday morning. I remember it because there was a hard frost, and the kitchen window had ice on the inside, which happened every winter, and I had come down early to get the range going. When I saw her standing at the worktop with her hand resting on her stomach the way women rest their hands on their stomachs when the life inside them has become undeniable, that unconscious cradling. And I stood at the foot of the stairs in my socks and vest, and I felt something move through me that I could not name then and still cannot name with precision. It was grief, something closely adjacent to grief. It was a recognition that this was real, that a child was real, that this specific child was real, that they were coming and would be here and would be part of this world in which I also had to exist. And there was no future in which that was not true. She saw me standing there. She took her hand away from her stomach. She said, "Morning." I said, "Morning." I saw to the range. We did not speak about it. We had become very practiced by then at not speaking about it. But that evening she asked me to sit with her, and I sat, and she said, "There's something I've been afraid to say to you." I said, "Go on then." She said, "I want to keep this baby. I want to raise this child. And I am asking." She stopped here, and this is a pause I will carry with me for the rest of my life, because it was everything she had never allowed herself to ask for. "I am asking if you will stay, not just in the house. I am asking if you will stay." She said it was not a fair thing to ask. She said she knew it wasn't fair. She said she had no right to ask it, that she had surrendered that right, that she would not blame me if the answer was no. But she asked because she said she had to know, because she said she still loved me, which was a thing I had not allowed myself to think about, because it was the most complicated piece of the whole impossible puzzle. She still loved me, and here is the monstrous, confusing, entirely human truth of it. I still loved her, not in the way I had loved her before. That version of the love was finished. You cannot unknow what I knew. You cannot stop the pictures your mind makes without permission, the unwanted film it plays at 3 in the morning in the dark. You cannot return to before, but there was something still present underneath the wreckage, the way there are always foundations under rubble, Coventry had taught us all that much. Something that had survived because it had gone too deep to be killed. I did not answer her that night. I asked for more time. She gave it to me without a word. I went to see Robert 3 weeks after that. I walked to his lodgings on Corporation Street, up the stairs that always smelled of boiled cabbage and pipe tobacco, and I knocked on his door. When he opened it, he had the look of a man waiting to hear how long he had left, which I suppose he was. I came in. I sat in the chair by the window. He sat on the bed. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then I said, I need to understand something. Not for your benefit. For mine. I need to understand what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life if you are in it, and what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life if you're not. Because at present I don't know how to manage either one. He said he had no answer to that. He said everything he had pushed through my letterbox over the past months had been inadequate because there was no adequate thing to say. He said he was not going to ask for my forgiveness because he hadn't owned the right to ask. He said if I decided to be done with him, he would understand and he would not trouble me again. He said if I decided otherwise, he would spend the remainder of his life being the man he ought to have been. I said nothing to that. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I stood up, put my cap on, and said I would let him know. And I walked back down the stairs that smelled of cabbage and tobacco and out into the cold street. I spent a week after that doing something that would sound peculiar if I described it to anyone. Every evening after the day shift, I walked to Radford Road Recreation Ground, the park where Robert and I had spent our boyhood Saturdays, where there was an old drinking fountain with a lion's head that hadn't worked since before the war, and a bandstand the council hadn't found the money to repair since the bombing. I sat on a bench near the bandstand, and I thought, not in any useful or organized way. I just sat and let whatever needed to come to the surface. Come, what came, in the end, was this: the rest of my life was mine to shape. I had choices, even when every one of them was hard. Leaving was a legitimate choice. Staying was also a legitimate choice. Neither made me a fool. Neither made me a saint. The question of Robert and the question of Margaret were separate questions, even though they had been lashed together by what happened between them, and I could answer them separately, and the answers were not required to match. I could forgive Margaret and not forgive Robert. I could eventually forgive Robert and still keep my distance. I could do both. I could do neither. But the life, my life, the one I actually wanted to live, that was the thing I needed to decide from, not from the wound, from the life I wanted. I came home on a Friday evening in November, and Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table darning a sock by the light of a single bulb, and she looked up when I came in. I stood in the doorway with my coat still on and my cap in my hand, and then I said, I'm staying. She set down the darning. She did not speak immediately. I said, I'm staying, and I need you to hear what that means. It means we build something different from what we had before. Not the same thing repaired, something new, with different terms. There are things I will need from you that you will have to give me steadily and without complaint for a long time before I can trust them. There will be nights when I am not all right, and I need you to let me not be all right without trying to put it right before it's ready to be put right. And this child, I stopped here because this was the hardest sentence I had ever had to form. This child is not mine, but they are coming, and I will need to work out, as we go, what I am to them and what they are to me. And I cannot tell you how that will look because I genuinely do not know yet. But I am staying. I am choosing to stay with my eyes fully open, which means I am also choosing to try. She was crying in a way she had not cried on the night she told me, which told me the relief in her was enormous, which told me she had been carrying the weight of my possible leaving every single day for months, and that was its own kind of suffering I had not fully reckoned with until I watched it leave her face. I will not tell you it was easy after that. It was not. There were rows that were really about the other thing. There were silences with a weight in them. There was an evening in January when I found one of Robert's old notes in the kitchen drawer where I had put them unread. And I read it, and I put my coat on and walked for 2 hours in the dark and the rain and came home soaked through. And Margaret heated water for me without a word, and neither of us spoke of it for 3 days. And then we spoke of it for the better part of the night. And it was the worst conversation I have ever sat through, and also, in some way I was not expecting. A necessary one. The child was born on a Thursday morning in March 1951. A girl, 5 pounds 12 ounces. The midwife came to the house. That was how it was done in our street. A district nurse in the bedroom and the neighbors knowing by the sound of it. I was in the front room with a cold cup of tea, and the wireless turned low. And when the midwife came downstairs and told me I could go up, I sat for another minute before I did. I stood in the bedroom doorway, and Margaret was propped against the pillows holding her. And the morning light was coming through the curtains the way winter light comes through thin curtains, pale and clear and without warmth. And there was something in the room that I cannot put a proper name to. Not peace, exactly. Something more like the feeling you get when something becomes undeniably real, larger than you had been steeling yourself for. This was a person who had not existed yesterday and existed today, and everything that had brought her here, the catastrophe of it, the betrayal, the long grinding months of learning to live inside a broken thing, all of it had also brought her here, and she had no knowledge of any of it, and she was entirely innocent of it, and she was looking at the ceiling with the vague, wondering eyes of someone who had just arrived and was trying to take the measure of the place. I walked in. I sat on the edge of the bed. Margaret asked, quietly, if I wanted to hold her, and I said yes. I held her. I do not know what I am to her yet. I know I am not her father. Robert is her father, and that is something he will have to navigate on terms still being determined, in conversations still to be had, on a road none of us can see the end of yet. But I was in that room on the morning she came into the world. I am still in this house on Raglan Road. I am still in this marriage, the new one, the one with different foundations, the one we are building from more honest materials than the first. My mother came round on the Sunday. She sat across from me in the front room while Margaret was resting, and she looked at me for a long moment in the way she had looked at me since I was a boy whenever she wanted the truth and not the performance of it. She said, "How are you?" I said, "Managing." She said, "The truth." I said, "Some days I'm managing. Some days I'm not." She nodded slowly. She said, "That is the truth." She said, "You are a better man than your father was." I said, "I am not doing this to be a better man." She asked, "Then what for?" And I thought about it for a genuine minute. Not the answer that sounds well, but the one that was actually true. And I said, "Because when I imagined walking out of this house for good, the life I pictured was smaller than the one I'm in. Even with all of it broken, even knowing everything I know, the life I'm in is larger." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and patted my hand the way she used when I was small, and had hurt myself, and she hadn't the words but wanted me to know she was present. Then she said the kettle was probably boiled by now, and she got up and went to make the tea. I thought about what it means to choose something damaged over something unencumbered. I thought about the bench by the old bandstand and the Lion's Head fountain that hadn't worked since before the war, and the back-to-back on Inkerman Street, and my mother's hands red from the washing, and my father who came home from the somewhat quieter man, and never recovered his full self, and Robert who wept at the factory gate, and Margaret who looked at me across a kitchen table without crying because she had already made her peace with losing me before she had finished speaking. And I thought, we are all, every single one of us on every terrace and every street in every bombed and rebuilt city in this exhausted country, just people trying to work out what to do with the hands we were dealt. And sometimes we play them badly, and sometimes we play them with more decency than anyone expected of us. And sometimes we just sit for a moment and stare at them, because the stakes are real and the cost is real, and there is no version of the game you walk away from without leaving something behind. I stayed. I don't know if I was right. I don't know if there is a right. I know I am still here. I know her name is June, because Margaret chose it for the month she had hoped all along the child would arrive in, though she came 3 months later, in the cold. I know June is 8 weeks old now and has begun to do something with the corners of her mouth that is not quite a smile, but is heading toward one. I know that when she does it, something in me responds before I have time to tell it not to. I know Robert and I have spoken twice since she was born. Brief conversations, careful ones. 2 men who used to share a bedroom on Inkerman Street, feeling their way along the edges of whatever we are now. Not nothing, not what we were. I know that every morning I wake up in this house and I make a choice. That is a thing nobody warned me about. Decisions like this one are not made once. They are made every morning. You do not choose and then rest. You choose, and then you choose again, and then you choose again. And what those daily choices eventually build, if you are steady and honest and present enough, is a life. I do not know if that life will be a happy one. I believe it can be. I believe there are things still available to me, to us, that are worth the effort of reaching for. I believe June deserves a house that is at least trying to hold itself together. I believe Margaret is trying, in ways I can see even on the days I do not want to see them. to become a woman she can stand to be. I believe, and this is a belief I hold most carefully, because it is the most fragile of the lot, that what I chose freely. Not from weakness, not from want of the courage to go, but because, standing on the far side of the worst year of my life, I looked at what remained in the rubble and decided it was worth rebuilding. We had all learned that much, at least from the war. I stayed, and for now, that is enough.
She took off her ring at a dinner table full of people who knew us both, and she smiled when she did it. Not the nervous smile of someone who had rehearsed a difficult conversation. Not the sad smile of a woman ending something she once loved. The smile she wore in that moment was the smile of someone who had planned this, who had chosen the audience carefully, who had decided long before that evening that this was how it was going to go, publicly, deliberately, with maximum damage. I sat across from her and watched it happen, and I didn't do what she expected me to do. That's the part she never recovered from. I've thought about that night more times than I can count. Not obsessively, not the way you turn something over and over looking for an exit. More the way you examine a scar after it's healed. Not because it still hurts, but because you want to understand exactly how the wound was made. I understand it now. I understand all of it now. And if you'll stay with me, I'll tell you everything. Not just what happened at that table, but everything that led up to it. Because what Megan did that night didn't begin that night. It began long before I was paying attention. And the signs are there. I just wasn't looking hard enough to find them. My name isn't important. What's important is that I was, for 4 years, a husband who believed he was in a marriage. Not a perfect marriage. I was never naive enough to think that, but a real one. The kind built on something actual. Megan and I had met through mutual friends at a rooftop gathering in late summer. The kind of evening where the light does half the work and everyone seems more interesting than they might be in an ordinary context. She was sharp and funny, and there was an energy about her that I mistook for a long time for passion. I understand now that what I was reading as passion was something closer to appetite. Megan wanted things. She pursued them without apology. At 28, watching someone move through the world with that kind of certainty, I found it magnetic. We were together for 8 months before I proposed. Some people thought that was fast. Looking back, I think Megan thought so too, but for different reasons than the people who raised their eyebrows at the timeline. They thought it was fast because they believed in caution. She thought it was fast because she hadn't finished evaluating her options. But she said yes, and I believed the yes, and we got married on a Saturday in September with 60 people watching and her best friend Lauren standing at her side, holding her bouquet. Lauren, I need to tell you about Lauren, because she matters to this story in ways I didn't begin to understand until much later. Lauren and Megan have been friends since their early 20s, the kind of friendship that accumulates so much shared history it starts to look like family. They had the same references, the same shorthand, the same ability to communicate entire conversations with a single look. When I entered Megan's life, Lauren was simply already there, at dinners at weekend away, at the small ordinary moments that make up a life. I liked her from the beginning. She was quieter than Megan, less theatrical, the kind of person who listened more than she spoke, and who asked questions that showed she had actually been paying attention to your answers. She made you feel, in her company, like what you said mattered. I didn't think about Lauren as anything other than my wife's best friend for the first 3 years of my marriage. I want to be honest about that. What happened later did not begin as something I saw it. It began as something that was already true, that had been true for longer than either of us had acknowledged, that only became visible when the thing obscuring it was removed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first year of the marriage was good, or good enough. In retrospect, I think I was doing what people do in the first year, investing so heavily in the idea of the thing that you don't examine the thing itself too closely. We built routines. We argued about small things and resolved them. We took a trip to Portugal in the spring and another to the Scottish coast in autumn. And there were moments in both places that felt genuinely happy, genuinely ours. And I held on to those moments for much longer than I should have, and the other kind of moments started arriving. The shift was gradual. That's what makes it so hard to name precisely. There was no single morning I woke up and registered that something had changed. It was more like a slow erosion. Each individual incident easily explainable, easily dismissed, but accumulating over time into a pattern that only became legible when I stopped explaining each piece in isolation and looked at all of it together. Megan started working late, not consistently at first, occasionally, plausibly, with reasons that made sense. A project deadline, a difficult client, the natural expansion of responsibility that comes with moving into a more senior role. I accepted these explanations without much examination because I was building my own workload at the time, and because I trusted her, and because when you've spent 4 years constructing a version of your life around a person, you develop a vested interest in not looking too hard at the cracks. I didn't realize it at the time, but the late nights were only part of it. There was also the phone. Megan had never been particularly private about her phone. We weren't the kind of couple who checked each other's messages. Not out of agreement exactly. More out of mutual disinterest, the comfortable assumption that there was nothing there requiring scrutiny. But somewhere in the second year of the marriage, I noticed that she had started carrying it differently. Face down on tables. Taken into rooms it hadn't previously followed her into. Angled away when she typed in a way that could have been habit, but felt, in the context of everything else, like deliberateness. I said nothing. I watched. What I noticed over the following months, watching without comment, was that Megan's relationship with me had subtly reorganized itself, not collapsed. She was too skilled for collapse, too invested in the performance of a functioning marriage to allow visible deterioration, but reorganized. The warmth she had once directed at me was still present, but it had the quality of a light on a timer, appearing on schedule, extinguishing when the schedule ended. She laughed at my jokes, but wasn't listening to the sentences that preceded them. She asked about my day and moved on before the answer was finished. I want to be fair to myself here and say that I raised it, not accusatorially. I didn't have anything specific to accuse her of, nothing that couldn't be dismissed as the ordinary friction of a long relationship. But I raised it. I said, one evening over dinner at our kitchen table, that I felt like we had been existing in parallel recently rather than together, and I asked if there was something she needed to talk about. She set down her fork and looked at me with an expression of patient concern, the expression of a woman managing a man's anxiety, and told me I was overthinking, that she was tired from work, that this was what long-term relationships looked like, and I needed to stop comparing reality to some fantasy version of what we should be. She delivered it kindly enough that I almost believed it. She was very good at kindness as deflection. That was the conversation that first introduced me to Daniel. She mentioned him almost as an afterthought toward the end of the conversation, in the particular way you mentioned something when you wanted to seem like an afterthought. A colleague, new to the team, very driven, she said, which was a quality Megan admired in people the way she admired anything that reflected her own self-image back at her. She told me they had been working closely together on a project that was taking up a lot of her energy. She said this easily, looking at me directly, with nothing in her expression that would have alarmed someone who was not already paying attention. I was paying attention. I wish I had noticed earlier exactly what I was seeing, but I filed it. I stored it alongside the phone and the late nights and the reorganized warmth, and I let the file sit. And I went on being a husband in the ways that were still available to me, practically, logistically, dutifully, while the thing I had built my life around continued, slowly and without my formal acknowledgement, to hollow itself out. Laura noticed before I did. I know that now. I can look back at specific moments over those months and see her watching the same things I was watching, arriving at the same conclusions I was resisting, carrying a knowledge she had not yet decided what to do with. There was an evening the three of us had dinner. Megan's suggestion, which itself should have told me something, because Megan never suggested things without purpose. And I remember Lauren being quieter than usual. Not uncomfortably quiet. The specific quiet of someone who is choosing their words very carefully, because the uncareful version would change everything. At one point, Megan left the table to take a call, and Lauren looked at me across the wine and the half-eaten food and said, almost carefully, How are you doing? Not as a pleasantry, as a question with weight behind it. I told her I was fine, which was the answer I had been giving everyone, including myself. She nodded slowly and didn't push, but she held the question in her eyes for a moment longer than the conversation required, and I thought about that look many times afterward. The dinner party was Megan's idea. Of course it was. It was a Friday evening in October, the kind of evening where autumn has fully committed and the warmth of the day is entirely historical. 8 people around a long table at a restaurant Megan had chosen for the same reason she chose everything. Because it projected a particular image, because the lighting was flattering and the menu was impressive, and the kind of people who ate there were the kind of people she wanted to be seen among. I had dressed carefully without knowing why I felt the need to be careful. Some part of me understood that the evening had a purpose I hadn't been told about. Daniel was there. She had mentioned him so casually, so repeatedly over the preceding months, that his presence at the table should have felt ordinary. It didn't. It felt like the missing piece of a picture I had been looking at incomplete, finally slotting into place. He was exactly what I had expected. Confident in the particular way of men who have been told they are impressive for long enough that they've stopped questioning it. Attentive to Megan in a way that had a practiced quality, as if he had learned her preferred register and was performing fluency in it. Lauren was there too, seated near me, as it happened, with the quiet attentiveness she always carried. I noticed her notice Daniel. I noticed the brief, careful neutrality that moved across her face when she looked at him and then at Megan. She picked up her wine and said nothing, which, from Lauren, was a statement. The first half of the evening proceeded the way these evenings proceed when the tension beneath them hasn't yet surfaced. Conversation about work, about travel, about the kind of nothing topics that exist to fill the space between people who are performing ease they don't entirely feel. I play my part. I was good at playing my part by then. 4 years of practice, hundreds of evenings, the accumulated fluency of a man who has learned to be present in a room while processing things in a private interior room that nobody else has access to. Megan had been building towards something all evening. I could feel it in the architecture of her attention, the way it kept measuring the room, the way she laughed a half second before the punchline, not because she anticipated it, but because she was already somewhere else, already rehearsing. The way her eyes returned to me at specific intervals with a quality that wasn't affection. It was something more like reconnaissance. What happened next changed everything. She lifted her wine glass. She did it slowly, the way you lift something when you want the movement to be registered. Conversation at the table drew toward it the way conversation always drew toward Megan when she decided to be its center, which was her gift and her pathology simultaneously. She looked around the table with a small, composed smile, and she said, in the voice she used when she wanted to sound casual and wasn't, some things just aren't forever. Then she looked directly at me, and she took off her ring. She did it with both hands. Deliberate, unhurried. She held it between 2 fingers for a moment, the gold catching the candlelight. And then she sat on the table in front of her and turned to Daniel and said, quietly enough to be intimate, but loudly enough for the table to receive it, now I'm free. The silence that followed was the specific silence of people who have just witnessed something they cannot immediately classify. Fork suspended, a glass set down without a sound, someone's chair shifting against the floor. The low music playing from somewhere inside the restaurant continued without interest, which felt almost obscene. The ordinary world continuing while something inside this particular corner of it had just stopped. I sat still. I could feel the weight of every eye at the table, the particular quality of attention that catastrophe produces in strangers, the compulsive need to witness, the discomfort of witnessing, the private relief that it is not happening to you. I could feel Megan's satisfaction from across the table, the completed quality of it, the way she leaned back very slightly, as if releasing a breath she had been holding for a long time. She had planned for me to crumble. She had built this evening as the architecture of my humiliation. And here it was, complete, delivered in public, irrefutable. I looked at the ring on the table. I looked at Lauren. Lauren was watching me with an expression I had never seen on her before. Not pity. She knew me well enough to know I didn't need pity and wouldn't accept it. Not horror, though what had just happened was horrifying. Something steadier than both of those. Something that looked, if I'm being precise, like a woman who has been holding a door open for a long time and is watching someone finally walk through it. I reached out and picked up the ring. Megan's eyes tracked the movement immediately, and something shifted in her expression. The first fault line in the performance. A half second of recalibration as her certainty about what I was going to do collided with the reality that I was not doing it. I stood up. The scrape of my chair against the floor was the loudest sound in the room. I felt the table's attention pivot completely. Felt the quality of it change from pity to something more complicated, and I turned to Lauren, and without a word, without a speech, without the kind of declaration that would have given Megan the dramatic confrontation she had prepared for, I slid the ring onto Lauren's finger. The sound that moved through the room wasn't a gasp exactly. It was something more fragmented. 8 people processing the same image at different speeds, each arriving at comprehension on their own timeline. Someone's hand knocked a glass. Silverware met porcelain without intention. I heard a sharp intake of breath from the woman 2 seats down who had spent the evening pretending not to sense the tension and could now no longer maintain the pretense. Lauren looked at her hand. Then she looked at me, and she smiled. Not a performance. Not a response to the room or the moment or what it would look like. A real smile. The kind that lives underneath everything else and only surfaces when there's no longer any reason to suppress it. She did not remove the ring. She let her hand rest open on the table, the gold catching the light, and she sat a little straighter, and the quality of her presence in that room changed in a way I could feel but couldn't have articulated. Megan erupted. Not immediately. There was a delay, 3 or 4 seconds, while she processed what she was seeing. Her face went through several things in that interval. Confusion first, because this was not in the script she had written. Then a hot, ascending fury as she understood exactly what had happened. Then something that looked almost like panic. Not panic at the act itself, but at the audience. At the faces around the table turning toward her in her moment of declared freedom, which she had intended to be triumphant and which had become, in a single gesture, something else entirely. She stood. Her chair screeched back too fast, too loud, and the noise undercut her immediately. Control doesn't screech, and she knew it, and the knowing made her angrier. What are you doing? Her voice had lost its performance. This was the underneath voice, the one that came out when the architecture fell. I didn't answer. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on Lauren, whose calm in that moment was the most devastating thing in the room, because it confirmed to everyone watching that this was not chaos. This was clarity. Lauren. Megan's voice cracked on the name in a way that told me everything about what she had assumed Lauren's loyalty would do in a moment like this. She had built 4 years of friendship on a version of Lauren, the quiet one, the loyal one, the one who stood behind and nodded and carried the bouquet. She had never once questioned whether that version was complete. Take it off. Give it back. She reached across the table. Lauren drew her hand back. One small, unhurried movement, and she said, in a voice so steady it stopped the room, "No." That was the moment the night broke completely. Not loudly. That's not how rooms break under the weight of something real. It was chairs and whispers and the specific, stifled sound of people who have witnessed something they will be talking about for years and cannot yet find the language for it. Megan's hand hung in the air over the empty space where Lauren's hand had been, and she stood there suspended in a moment she could not reverse, in front of every person she had assembled to watch her with. Daniel, beside her, was studying the tablecloth. He did not look at Megan once in the minutes that followed. I watched him not look at her. Everyone at the table watched him not look at her. There's a specific kind of cowardice in a man who positions himself as the reason a woman is free and then refuses to be present in the moment the freedom becomes complicated. People remember that. People had already begun to remember it. Megan tried to recover. She was gifted and she had resources, and she was not going to go down without attempting to reclaim the room she had been so certain was hers. She forced a sound that was meant to be a laugh and said something about how people were overreacting, how this was all being made into something it wasn't. The words came out brittle, and the room did not receive them. You can hear the difference between authority and its performance, and by now the whole table could hear it. She looked around for support and found none. Not hostile faces, careful ones, arranged in the particular blankness of people who have decided not to become part of something by choosing a side. I sat down. I had made what I came to make. I had not shouted, not accused, not given her the explosive scene she had prepared to reframe as evidence of my instability. I had done one thing quietly and let the room do the rest. Lauren sat beside me with her hand resting gently on the table. She didn't gloat. That wasn't who she was. She was simply present, fully, finally, without the careful management of herself that living in Megan's orbit had always required. At one point, when the table was trying to re-knit itself with forced conversation, she caught me looking at her, and she said nothing, just held the look, and it was everything that didn't need to be said yet. The dinner continued the way things continue after structural damage. Mechanically, out of social obligation, each participant performing normalcy with declining conviction. The food that arrived after that received almost no attention. Conversations sparked and extinguished. Megan's coworker left early with a reason nobody believed. Megan sat in her chair and drank her wine without tasting it, and her ring finger was bare, and every person at the table was aware of it without looking at it directly, because that's how shame works in a room. Not by being named, but by being everywhere. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part for Megan was Lauren. Not the ring, not me. Lauren, because Megan could reframe me. She had been reframing me for years, constructing the narrative of a husband who was too cautious, too quiet, too unwilling to meet her where she lived. She had a story about me ready for every audience, but she had no story for Lauren. Lauren was the one who had stood beside her at every chapter of her adult life, who knew every version of her, who had absorbed every confidence and kept every secret and shown up without conditions. Lauren was the proof of Megan's worth as a person, the relationship that justified everything else. And Lauren had said no. That one word had done more damage than anything I could have said across 4 years of marriage, because it told the room and it told Megan that the person who knew her best had looked at what she was doing and had chosen differently. Eventually, the evening ended the way evenings end when they have exceeded their purpose. Guests excused themselves with the careful politeness of people managing an exit from a scene. Coats were gathered. Goodbyes were said, to me, to Lauren, with a warmth that contained, just beneath its surface, a kind of acknowledgement. Not to Megan, not with any warmth. To Megan with the particular brevity of people who have seen enough to know where they don't want to stand. Lauren and I left together. At the door I paused, not for effect, not to look back at Megan, just the natural hesitation of a threshold. Behind us, the restaurant noise was already absorbing back into its ordinary register, the way spaces do when events have happened in them and the events are over. I did not look back. There was nothing behind me I needed to see. The street outside was cold and dark and entirely indifferent. A city going about its business, traffic in the distance, air that smelled like autumn and petrol, and the specific cleanness of night air after time spent inside. Lauren's hand found mine, and we walked without speaking for a while, because there was nothing that needed to be said that hadn't already been said. That was 7 months ago. There's a version of this story in which what I did was impulsive, performed, a piece of theater designed to wound. I have told you enough of the truth that you can judge that for yourself. What I know is that it was not planned further in advance in the moment in which it happened, that I sat at that table with no intention other than to survive the evening with my dignity intact, and that what I did was not revenge. It was recognition of what Megan had made the ring mean by removing it, of what Lauren had been, quietly and without announcement, for longer than either of us had let ourselves acknowledge. Megan filed for divorce 3 weeks later. I did not contest it. The process was handled by solicitors and characterized by the particular exhaustion of two people dismantling something they had built from different materials and for different reasons. She did not speak to Lauren again, which was a loss I grieved on Lauren's behalf, even as I understood it was inevitable. You cannot revise the story of your life to accommodate the person who changed its ending. I think about what she must have felt in the months after that dinner. not with satisfaction. That's not the emotion, or at least not the one that stays. More with something like clarity, because Megan had arranged that evening so carefully, had chosen those people, that setting, that moment. She had given herself the best possible conditions for her performance, and she had done it brilliantly, and it had still collapsed. Not because of anything she failed to anticipate about me, but because of something she had never thought a question about Lauren. That's where the plan broke down, in the assumption that the people who know you best will always protect the version of yourself you've chosen to show the world. Sometimes the people who know you best are simply the people who have seen the most. Lauren is beside me as I speak this. She is reading in the next room with a cup of tea and the quiet ease of someone who has settled into a life that fits. And if I told her I was telling this story, she would probably say something dry and understated that would make me laugh. She remembers that evening differently than I do in some ways. She says she had already decided before I picked up the ring that the decision had been made somewhere in the weeks before, that she was simply waiting for the moment to confirm it. I believe her. I have come to understand that Lauren had always been several steps ahead of the room. Megan had spent years building an audience. She had cultivated her relationships as carefully as a set designer cultivates a stage, placing each person where the light would hit them correctly, where they would perform their function in the story she was telling about herself. She just forgot that the people on her stage had their own stories. And on that particular evening, in that particular restaurant, with the candles and the champagne and the ring sitting on the white tablecloth like a prop she had placed for effect, one of them finally told hers. The hotel key card was still in her coat pocket when she walked through her front door that night. I found it 3 days later. I wasn't looking for it. That's the thing about discovering a lie that has been running for a long time inside your own house. You don't find it because you went searching. You find it because it got careless, because the person telling it got comfortable, because somewhere along the way they stopped being afraid of you and started being afraid of something else entirely. I found the key card on a Wednesday morning in February, going through the coat closet for my own jacket. It fell out of her coat pocket and landed face up on the floor. The hotel name was printed across the front, a place on the north side of Atlanta I had never been to and had never heard my wife mention. I stood there for a long time looking at it. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I was not a suspicious man. I had never been the kind of husband who checked phones or asked questions that were really accusations dressed up as conversation. 5 years of marriage had not made me paranoid. If anything, 5 years of marriage had done the opposite. It had made me comfortable. It had made me certain in the way that people become certain when nothing has ever happened to challenge the story they've built their life around. That key card challenged it. Not conclusively. Not yet. There were explanations. Work events. A surprise she was planning. Something I was forgetting. I ran through all of them standing in that closet with the card in my hand, and I put it back where I found it, and I went to work and I did not say a word. But I started paying attention. My name is Marcus. I'm 41 years old. I grew up in Decatur, went to Georgia State, spent my 30s building a career in commercial real estate that finally started paying what it was worth around the time I turned 36. By the time any of this happened, I was doing well. Not wealthy, comfortable. The kind of comfortable that lets you stop thinking about money and start thinking about everything else. I met Danielle at a birthday party for a mutual friend in the summer of 2018. She was 30 at the time, working in marketing for a healthcare company downtown, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately understood its social architecture. She knew who mattered, who was performing, who was genuinely there. She had a way of making you feel like she had chosen you specifically out of everyone available, which I understand now was not a quality unique to her relationship with me. It was just how she operated. We dated for a year and a half before I proposed. We married in October 2019, 60 people at a venue in Midtown, her mother crying through the entire ceremony, my father giving a toast that went 8 minutes longer than anyone expected and was somehow still not long enough. It was a good wedding. For a long time, I believed it was the beginning of a good marriage. I didn't realize it at the time, but the story Danielle was performing for me and the story she was actually living had started to separate long before I found that key card. The key card was just the moment the separation became physical evidence. The first year was good. I want to be honest about that. Whatever came later, the first year was real, or felt real, which for a long time I thought was the same thing. We built the life you build in the first year. The apartment in Buckhead that we spent 3 weekends furnishing. The Sunday routine that became sacred without us deciding it would. The arguments that stayed small and resolved before they calcified into anything permanent. The second year was mostly good. The third year is where I would go back to if I could. Not because anything specific happened in the third year that I could point to and say, that was the moment. Nothing that clean. More because when I look back now with the full picture in front of me, the third year is where the texture of things started to change. Subtle enough that I explained it away every time. Significant enough that I remember it now with a clarity that feels almost like grief. Danielle started going to the gym in the evenings. That was the first thing. She had always been health conscious. That wasn't new, but the routine shifted from mornings, which had always been her preference, to evenings 3 or 4 nights a week, sometimes not getting home until 8:30 or 9. The gym she had joined was new, different from the one she'd always used. Better equipment, she said. Better classes. Further away, I noticed but didn't say. I didn't say a lot of things in that third year. I was busy. That's the honest answer. The commercial real estate market in Atlanta had started moving in ways that require my full attention. And I was putting in the hours. And when you're putting in the hours at work, you develop a habit of not looking too closely at the hours being put in elsewhere. You want the home front to be stable. You need it to be stable. So you accept the explanations that allow it to stay stable, and you keep moving. I wish I had paid closer attention. Because the gym was only the beginning. The phone came next. Danielle had never been secretive about her phone. We weren't that couple. We didn't have each other's passwords written down somewhere. But we'd hand each other our phones without a second thought to pull up a restaurant address or skip a song. That casual openness had been part of the fabric of how we operated for 3 years. Somewhere in year 3 it changed. Small things at first. The phone placed face down when she sat on the counter. A new habit of taking it to the bathroom that hadn't existed before. The angle of the screen shifting away from me when notification came through. A movement so practiced, I wasn't sure at first whether I was seeing it or imagining it. I was seeing it. I told myself I was imagining it. This is what I know now about the way a lie operates inside a long relationship. It doesn't arrive. It grows. It starts as something small enough to explain away, and it feeds on every explanation you give it until it has gotten big enough that explaining it away is the only coping mechanism you have left. By the time you stop explaining, it is enormous. It has been enormous for longer than you know. I kept explaining until February. The key card ended that. For 3 days after finding it, I watched her. I had never watched Danielle before. Not like that. Not with the tension that was really interrogation. But now I was watching the way she moved through the house, the way she held her phone, the way she said my name when she wanted something, and the way she didn't say it when she didn't. I was watching for the seams, for the places where the performance had gotten thin. I found one on the third day. She told me on a Thursday evening that she had a work event Friday night. A client dinner. She might be home late, she said, in the particular casual tone of someone delivering information they have rehearsed. She said it while loading the dishwasher, not looking at me, which was either ordinary multitasking or the specific body language of a person who has learned not to make eye contact when they are lying. I said that was fine. I said it was fine, and I went to bed, and I lay there in the dark, and I thought about the key card and the gym and the phone and the client dinner, and I made a decision. Friday morning, after Danielle left for work, I picked up her phone. She had changed the passcode. I didn't know the new one. I sat with that information for a moment. A changed passcode is not evidence of anything by itself. People change passcodes. But this was a woman who had used the same 4-digit code for 3 years, her mother's birth year, and had changed it sometime in the last several months without mentioning it, without having any reason I could identify to mention it, without having any reason I could identify to change it. I put the phone down. I went to work. I left work at 2 in the afternoon, which I never do, and I sat in my car in the parking garage, and I thought about what I was doing and what I was about to do, and whether there was a version of the next 24 hours in which I was wrong about everything. I wanted there to be. I need you to understand that. I wanted to be wrong. 5 years is not nothing. A life built with someone is not nothing. The version of the future I had been carrying, the house we had talked about in Cascade Heights, the children that had moved from abstract to specific in our conversations over the last year, the whole architecture of what came next, none of that was nothing. I wanted the key card to be a work event. I wanted the change passcode to be a security update. I wanted the gym to be the gym. I stayed in that parking garage for 45 minutes. Then I went home. I knew Danielle's habits. I knew what time she would start getting ready for the supposed client dinner. I knew which bag she would take, which shoes she would choose, what the process looked like from the other side of the bathroom door. I had watched it hundreds of times without watching it. I watched it that evening with complete attention. She was careful. I'll give her that. The outfit was professional enough. The explanation, offered once more as she touched up her makeup, was delivered with the ease of someone who has said a thing so many times it no longer cost them anything to say. Client dinner. Downtown. Don't wait up. She kissed me on the cheek on her way out. I waited 12 minutes. Then I got in my car and I followed her. What happened next changed everything. She didn't go downtown. She drove north. I stayed 3 cars back, far enough not to be visible, close enough not to lose her in Atlanta's Friday night traffic. She drove for 22 minutes, and she pulled into the parking lot of a hotel on the north side of the city. The same hotel name that was on the key card. I parked on the far end of the lot, and I sat in my car, and I watched her walk inside without looking back. Unhurried, comfortable, the walk of someone arriving somewhere familiar. I didn't move for a long time. There's a specific kind of pain that arrives not as an explosion, but as a settling, like something that was suspended finally making contact with the ground. I had known, in the way you know things before you let yourself know them, for longer than I wanted to admit. But knowing before you let yourself know, and watching your wife walk into a hotel on a Friday night, when she told you she was at a client dinner, are 2 entirely different experiences. One lives in the back of your mind. The other lives in your body. I got out of the car. I walked into the hotel lobby, and I went to the front desk, and I told the woman behind the counter that I was meeting my wife, and I had forgotten the room number. I gave Danielle's name. I said I had the reservation confirmation on my phone, but couldn't find it. She looked at the screen for a moment. She gave me a room number. I rode the elevator to the 4th floor. I walked down a corridor that smelled like hotel corridors everywhere. That specific combination of carpet cleaner and recycled air that exists nowhere else on Earth. I found the door. I stood in front of it. I want to tell you I was calm. I wasn't calm. My hands were completely still, and my face was completely still, and something in my chest was doing something I didn't have a word for. Not anger. Not yet. Something that comes before anger. The last few seconds before the thing you didn't want to be true finishes becoming true. I knocked. Silence for a moment. Then movement inside. Then the specific pause of someone checking the people. The door opened. A man stood in the doorway. Korean, late 30s, dressed like he'd been in the room for a while. He looked at me the way people look at someone they were not expecting. His expression went through several things in a short interval. Confusion first, then a realization moving across his face that told me he knew exactly who I was, which meant Danielle had told him about me, which was its own kind of information. Behind him, further back in the room, I heard her voice. "Who is it?" He didn't answer her. He looked at me, and he said, "Nothing," and I looked at him, and I said, "Nothing," and in that silence, everything that needed to be communicated was communicated. Then Danielle appeared behind him. She saw me. The color left her face in a way I had never seen before and have not seen since. Not guilt exactly. Something beyond guilt. The specific expression of someone watching the architecture of their double life make contact with itself. She said my name, just my name, once in a voice that had lost all the practiced ease of the last several months. I didn't say anything. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I turned around and I walked back down the corridor and I rode the elevator down to the lobby and I walked out into the Atlanta night and I got in my car. That's when everything made sense. All of it. The gym, the phone, the key card that fell out of her coat pocket like it was tired of being hidden. Every explanation I had accepted. Everything I had decided not to say. Every morning, I had woken up next to a woman who was keeping a version of her life from me that was apparently detailed enough that the man in that hotel room knew my name. I drove home. I sat in our apartment, and I looked at the life we had assembled. The furniture we had chosen together, the photographs on the walls, the evidence of 5 years of shared construction. And I felt nothing that resembled what I expected to feel. Not the explosive grief of a man whose marriage has just ended. Something quieter than that. Something that felt almost like the relief of a question finally answered, which was worse in some ways than the grief would have been. She came home 40 minutes later. I was sitting in the living room in the dark when she walked in. She turned on the light and saw me and stopped moving. She was still dressed the same way she'd left. Her makeup was slightly less perfect than it had been. She was holding her phone with both hands the way people hold things when they need something to hold. She started talking immediately. This is what I noticed. She had a prepared version. Some of it, anyway. The beginning of an explanation that had clearly been assembled in the car on the way home. Partial truths, reframings, the kind of language designed to create enough ambiguity that a conversation can be redirected. She was good at language. She had always been good at language. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching her recalibrate in real time when she realized the prepared version wasn't landing. When she saw that I wasn't asking questions, wasn't raising my voice, wasn't giving her anything to work with. I just sat there and let her talk and watched her hear herself and watched the explanation getting smaller and smaller the more she said. She stopped talking. The room was quiet.